Hey there, midnight thinkers. You've seen the crucifixion 1,000 times. Movies, stained glass, gold paint on church walls. And you've been watching it on fast forward, blowing right past the good stuff. Tonight we hit pause, because the cross isn't one sad afternoon. It's a puzzle, and every piece was planted in ancient writings centuries before that day. The last word Jesus spoke, "It is finished," was the exact word merchants stamped on a settled bill to mean paid in full. The darkness at noon, a prophet called it 7 centuries early. And the sign over his head was written in 3 languages at once, turning a death sentence into the first worldwide announcement in history. Smooth move, pilot, so we're going to freeze this scene and pull out 25 hidden meanings hiding in plain sight. The wood, the dice, the darkness, all of it. But first, tell me, where on the planet are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments, smash that like button, and let's get into it. So we begin our slow motion tour not at the cross itself, but a short walk downhill from the city in a cramped little grove of olive trees on the slope of a hill called the Mount of Olives. It is late, it is dark, and it is the exact spot where the single most important image in this entire story gets quietly slipped into the frame, long before a single nail is anywhere in sight. Miss this moment and everything that follows loses half its meaning, which is precisely why almost everybody misses it. Here is the picture. Jesus is on the ground, on his knees, and he is praying something that sounds, on the surface, like a very human request. He asks that this cup might be taken away from him. That is the line, "Let this cup pass." And if you have only ever half listened to this scene, which, let us be honest, most of us have, since we were usually mentally reviewing what was for lunch, you probably filed it away under the heading of a man who is understandably scared of dying, which is fair enough. Nobody schedules their own execution and whistles on the way there. But that reading, comforting as it is, completely flattens what is actually happening, because the word cup here is not a throwaway. It is a loaded, ancient, carefully chosen word, and the people listening in that garden would have flinched the second they heard it. To understand why, you have to know that in the Hebrew scriptures, a cup is almost never just a cup. It is one of the oldest metaphors in the entire library, and it shows up again and again with a very specific and very unpleasant meaning. The cup is the cup of the wrath of God. It is the image the prophets reached for whenever they wanted to describe divine judgment being poured out and handed over to somebody who has to drink the whole thing down. You find it in the Psalms, where the wicked are made to drink a cup filled to the brim. You find it in Isaiah, who describes a staggering, reeling cup that leaves whoever drinks it flat on the ground like a man who has had a truly regrettable evening. You find it in Jeremiah, where entire nations are lined up and forced to take the cup one after another, no exceptions, no substitutions, no asking the waiter for something a bit lighter. This was not subtle imagery. This was the standard, well-worn shorthand for judgment that you drink to the very bottom, right down to the bitter dregs at the base of the cup where all the sediment settles. And that phrase, "to the dregs," is worth slowing right down on, because it carried a weight for ancient listeners that it has almost entirely lost for us. Wine back then was nothing like the clean, filtered thing you pour today. It was made and stored in a way that left a thick layer of sediment settling at the very bottom of the vessel. A gritty, bitter sludge of residue that nobody in their right mind actually wanted in their mouth. At an ordinary meal, once you had had your fill, you simply left that last cloudy mouthful behind. Drinking the dregs was not a thing pleasant people did. Only someone being forced to finish a cup as a punishment, someone with no say in the matter, was made to go all the way down to that final vile swallow. So when the prophets talk about draining the cup of wrath to the dregs, they are not reaching for a bit of poetry. They are describing the total, no exceptions version of the thing. Not a sip, not most of it. The entire vessel emptied right down to the bitter grit at the bottom that everyone else gets to leave behind. And that, precisely, is the cup being wrestled with under the olive trees. Not a symbolic taste of suffering mercifully cut short. The whole thing, sediment and all, with nothing left over and nothing skipped. Hold on to that image of a man determined to finish the cup completely, because much later, near the end, he is going to be offered a drink that would have taken the edge off, and he is going to refuse it. And it will make a great deal more sense once you remember he had already decided, in this garden, not to leave a single drop unfinished. And that is the first meaning most people walk straight past. Picture the cup not as a small ceremonial goblet, but as a vessel that has been slowly filling up for a very, very long time. Every act of cruelty, every betrayal, every lie, every ordinary human failure, drop by drop, century after century, into the same cup. By the time we arrive at that garden, it is not a cup you would want to be within arm's reach of, let alone required to finish. And the horror of what Jesus is wrestling with is that this cup, this accumulated weight of everything that has ever gone wrong, was, in the logic of the story, supposed to be handed to us, to humanity, to drink ourselves, which would have been, to put it mildly, the worst last call in history. So the request in the garden is not simply a man asking to skip the pain, it is a man staring at a cup that was meant for everyone else and quietly deciding to drink it in their place. That is meaning number one, and it reframes the whole scene. He is not running from the cup. After a long night on his knees, he picks it up. And the follow-up detail is the part that turns the whole thing from tragedy into something closer to a rescue, because the very same Hebrew scriptures that gave us the cup of wrath also mention a completely different cup, a cup of salvation, something you lift up gratefully and drink to celebrate being delivered. Two cups, one filled with judgment, one filled with rescue. And the entire hinge of the story is that these two cups get swapped. He takes the one nobody could survive, and in exchange, he hands over the one nobody deserved. It is, frankly, an appalling trade for him, and a suspiciously good deal for everybody else, which is more or less the whole point. Keep that swap in the back of your mind, because we are going to watch it play out in slow motion for the rest of this video, and it starts right here in the dark, under the olive trees. Speaking of those olive trees, this is where the garden itself gets in on the symbolism, and honestly, it is almost too neat. The place is called Gethsemane. Lovely name, sounds peaceful, the sort of thing you would put on a scented candle. Except that Gethsemane in Hebrew does not mean tranquil garden retreat. It means oil press. Gat Shemanim, the press for the oils. This was not a spa. It was essentially an agricultural workshop, an olive processing site, the ancient equivalent of a small factory where the fruit from all those surrounding trees was brought to be crushed. And once you know that, the location stops being a pretty backdrop and starts being the single most on-the-nose piece of set design in the entire story. Because here is how you actually get olive oil, and it is not a gentle process. You do not politely ask the olive for its oil, you crush it. Whole olives, still bearing the marks of the trees they grew on, are piled up and ground under an enormous heavy stone, mashed into a rough pulp. And even that is only the beginning, because the first crush just breaks the fruit open. To get the good oil out, the pulp is then loaded into baskets, stacked up, and squeezed under the crushing weight of massive stone slabs, pressed harder and harder until every last bit of oil is forced out under pressure so intense there is simply nowhere left for it to hide. It is the same principle as wine, really. You cannot get wine without treading the grapes into mush, and you cannot get oil without pulverizing the olives. The good stuff only comes out when the fruit is broken, not exactly the peaceful harvest festival the greeting cards imply. Now sit with the picture. On this particular night, in this particular place, surrounded by presses built for one purpose, which is to crush fruit until it yields, there is a man on the ground being crushed by the weight of what is coming. The setting and the suffering are describing the exact same process. The olives around him are pressed for their oil. He is pressed for something else entirely. And this is meaning number two, and it is not a coincidence anyone invented after the fact, because the prophet Isaiah had described precisely this centuries earlier in one of the most quietly devastating passages in the whole collection. Isaiah writes about a servant who is crushed and pierced, not for his own wrongdoing, but for everyone else's. Crushed for our failures, bruised for the things we got wrong. The same verb, the same image, the same relentless pressure applied to the innocent so that something good can be squeezed out for the guilty. He is, in the most literal sense the location allows, being pressed. In an oil press, on a hill covered in oil presses. If a screenwriter had pitched this, an editor would have sent it back for being too obvious. And here is where the olive symbolism goes from clever to almost unfair, because you have to understand just how central olive oil actually was to everyday life back then. This was not a niche ingredient you kept in a fancy bottle for special occasions. Olive oil was the substance that ran the entire world. It was food, poured over bread and cooked into nearly everything. It was fuel, the thing that burned in every lamp and kept the dark at bay after sunset, so that literally the only reason anyone could see at night was crushed olives quietly burning away in a dish. It was medicine, rubbed into wounds to soothe and protect them. It was the base of every perfume and every ointment. And most importantly of all, it was the thing you poured over someone's head to mark them out as chosen, as set apart for a special role. When a new king was crowned, you did not hand him a hat. You anointed him, which meant you poured oil over him. When a priest was appointed, same thing, oil poured out, marking the moment someone became who they were meant to be. And this is the detail that turns the whole scene into something close to a bad pun made by the universe, except deadly serious. Because the word for someone who has been anointed with oil, the chosen one, the marked one, is Messiah. And when you translate that word into Greek, it becomes a word you already know extremely well. Christ. The title is not a surname. It literally means the anointed one, the one covered in oil. So sit with the arrangement. The anointed one, whose entire identity is built on the imagery of oil, the substance of kings and priests and light and healing, is kneeling on the ground in the exact place where that oil is manufactured. And the only way that oil has ever been produced in the entire history of the process is by crushing the fruit until it has nothing left to give. The blessing that lights every lamp, heals every wound, and crowns every king exists only because something was broken first. The man named for the oil is in the place of the press. You could not write it more pointedly if you tried, and frankly, if a student handed this in as fiction, you would tell them to tone it down. And the garden gives us one final detail that ties the crushing image together. And it is a strange one that people usually skip because it sounds like an exaggeration. The account tells us that as he prayed, in genuine anguish, his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, for a long time, this was written off as a poetic license, a dramatic flourish, except that modern medicine actually has a name for this. It is a rare but documented condition where, under conditions of extreme stress and terror, the tiny blood vessels around the sweat glands can rupture, and a person can, quite literally, sweat blood. It is exceptionally uncommon, and it tends to only appear in cases of severe psychological distress, the kind you might experience if, say, you were fully aware of everything that was about to happen to you and had not yet found a way out of it. So the bloody sweat is not a metaphor bolted on for effect. It is, unsettlingly, the sort of thing that happens to a real human body under real, unbearable pressure. Even his sweat is playing into the theme of the press. The man is being squeezed before anyone has laid a finger on him. And there is one more layer to the loneliness of that garden that makes the whole scene land harder, which is that he did not go into it alone. He brought his closest friends with him, the inner circle, the ones who had walked with him for years. And he asked them for something almost embarrassingly small. He asked them to stay awake, just to keep watch nearby while he prayed. 1 hour, that was the entire request. And in a detail so painfully human, it would be funny if the circumstances were not what they were. They fell asleep, not once. He came back to check on them, found them all snoring, woke them, asked them again, went back to pray, and returned to find them dozing off a second time. And then, unbelievably, a third. The most important night in the story, and his support team keeps drifting off like passengers on a late train. He even says the line that anyone who has ever tried to stay awake past their limit knows all too well, that the spirit is willing, but the body is exhausted, which in fairness is the truest thing anyone says all night. But the sleeping friends are not just there for a bit of relatable comedy. They are there to sharpen the point that he is carrying this entirely by himself. He asked for company and got snoring. He asked for solidarity and got 3 men who could not keep their eyes open. The old account adds one more quiet detail here, that at some point an angel appeared to strengthen him, which tells you everything about where the actual support was coming from. Heaven sends reinforcements. His best friends send silence and the soft sound of people asleep on the job. 3 separate times he goes back to that same prayer about the cup, and 3 separate times he gets up and keeps going, alone, while everyone who promised they would stand by him is quietly unconscious a few feet away. Whatever he is drinking it on his own. So take a step back and notice what the garden has done. Before we have reached any of the famous imagery, before the crowd, before the trial, before the hill, the story has already handed us its master key. One word, cup. A cup of wrath drunk in our place, a cup of salvation handed back in exchange, and all of it staged inside a press designed to crush fruit until it gives up everything it has. The whole drama of what follows is already folded up inside that single image, waiting. And that cup, the one he agreed to drink, is not gone. It is going to show up again later, near the very end, when someone offers him a drink laced with something bitter. And we will pick that thread back up when we get there. For now, just remember that the story did not start at the cross. It started with a man in the dark, agreeing to drink something the rest of us could never have survived. From the garden, the story moves fast and the setting changes completely, and this is where we run headfirst into a scene that looks, at first glance, like nothing more than a legal mess. Jesus has been arrested, dragged through the night from one hearing to the next, and by morning he is standing in front of the Roman governor, a man named Pilate, who very clearly does not want to be dealing with any of this before he has finished his breakfast. Pilate is a politician in the worst possible position, caught between a prisoner he can find no real fault with and a crowd that is getting louder and angrier by the minute. And so he reaches for a way out that on paper sounds almost reasonable. There was, we are told, a local custom around this time of year where the governor would release one prisoner, whoever the people asked for, as a kind of goodwill gesture for the festival. Think of it as an extremely high-stakes crowd request, except instead of a song, the crowd gets to pick which condemned man walks free. So Pilate, thinking he has found a clever escape hatch, offers the crowd a choice. On one side, the man in front of him, against whom he can find no genuine charge. On the other, a prisoner already sitting in custody with a genuinely alarming resume, a man named Barabbas. And here is where it helps to know exactly who Barabbas was, because the story tends to reduce him to a vague label, a robber, a bad man, some background villain. In reality, he was rather more serious than that. He was a man arrested for taking part in an uprising, an insurrection against Roman rule, and in the course of it, there had been a killing. This was not a petty thief who nicked some bread. This was a violent political prisoner, precisely the sort of person a governor keeps locked up specifically so he does not cause any more trouble. If you were building a lineup of people you would absolutely not want released back into a tense, overcrowded city during a major holiday, Barabbas would be near the top of the list. And Pilate, it is worth saying, is not the coldly confident tyrant you might picture. He is a man sweating through his robes. Governing this particular corner of the empire was widely regarded as one of the least desirable postings you could be handed, the sort of assignment you got when someone in Rome wanted you far away and mildly punished. The population was proud, the tensions were permanent, and the festival crowds were enormous and easily lit. A single riot on his watch could end his career, or worse, and here one is brewing over a man he can find no reason to condemn. He tries, genuinely, to wriggle out of it. He questions the prisoner and comes up empty. He tries to pass the problem to someone else entirely, shipping him off to another local ruler in the hope of making it somebody else's headache, and gets the man politely sent right back. Every exit he reaches for is quietly locked. He even gets a warning from the one person in the entire episode who seems to grasp what is happening, and it comes from an unexpected direction. His own wife sends him an urgent message, right there while he is seated in judgment, telling him to have nothing to do with this innocent man because she has been badly disturbed by a dream about him. It is a small, strange moment that is easy to skip past. The single voice trying to stop the whole thing belongs to a woman who is never named, never appears again, and is completely ignored. Pilate reads the message and carries on anyway, because the crowd is louder than his conscience and considerably louder than his wife. And yet, in one of the great, grim ironies of the whole account, that is exactly who the crowd asks for. Given the straight choice between the innocent man and the insurrectionist, they call for the insurrectionist. The guilty man walks. The innocent man is condemned. And then comes the gesture that made his name a byword forever after. Having run out of options, Pilate calls for a basin of water, and in front of the entire crowd, he washes his hands, announcing that he is innocent of what is about to happen, and that the responsibility belongs to them, not to him. It is, when you think about it, an astonishing bit of theater. As if guilt were a kind of grime you could simply rinse off under the tap. As if a man with the full authority to stop the whole thing could absolve himself of a decision by performing a little hygiene in public. He wants the outcome without owning the choice, which is, unfortunately, the oldest move in the entire political playbook and one that has aged not a single day. The hands may have come out clean, the decision did not, and most people, watching this play out, read it as pure injustice, a mob getting it catastrophically wrong, the system failing in the most spectacular way possible. Which it is, but it is also something far stranger and far more deliberate, because this exact swap, the guilty going free while an innocent substitute is handed over in his place, was not an accident of Roman politics. It was a ritual, a very old one. And it had been acted out deliberately and ceremonially once a year, for roughly 15 centuries before that morning in front of Pilate. To see it, you have to rewind all the way back to the ancient instructions for the holiest day in the entire calendar, a day set aside specifically for dealing with the accumulated wrongdoing of an entire people. On that day, the high priest was told to take 2 goats, not 1, 2, and the 2 goats had very different fates, decided by lot. The first goat was sacrificed, its life given as an offering to deal with the guilt of the nation, standard, if grim, procedure. But the second goat is where it gets genuinely fascinating and where the parallel with Barabbas snaps into focus. Over the head of that second goat, the high priest would place his hands and, in a kind of solemn transfer, symbolically load onto it all the wrongdoing, all the failures, all the guilt of the entire community. Every single thing the people had done wrong that year, ceremonially piled onto one animal. And then, crucially, that goat was not killed. It was led away, alive, out of the camp and off into the wilderness, carrying all that guilt away with it, never to be seen again. It walked free so that the people it represented could be considered clean. And it is worth pausing on how those 2 goats were assigned their very different fates, because it was not the high priest quietly picking a favorite. The 2 animals were deliberately chosen to be as alike as possible, matched in size and value and appearance, so that standing side by side, you genuinely could not tell which one was headed for which end. Then their futures were settled by lot, a kind of solemn, sacred coin toss, 1 goat marked for the offering and 1 marked to be led away alive. The whole arrangement was built to make a quiet but pointed statement. There was nothing special about either animal that earned its outcome. The one that lived was not braver or better or more deserving than the one that did not. It simply drew the lot that spared it, and that lands with a certain force the moment you drag it back over to Barabbas, because there was likewise nothing about Barabbas that made him the one who ought to walk. He was not the more sympathetic of the 2 prisoners. He was, if anything, by a considerable margin, the worse man. And yet the lot, so to speak, fell his way. His freedom had nothing to do with his character and everything to do with which name the crowd ended up calling out. This second goat had a name, or at least a designation, and it is the origin of a word you still use today without ever wondering where it came from. The scapegoat, the one who escapes, the guilt carrier who is driven off alive into the empty wild, sent away toward a mysterious place or figure the old texts call Azazel, somewhere out past the last edge of the settled world. 2 goats then standing side by side at the start of the day, identical enough that only the drawing of lots decided which was which. 1 dies as a sacrifice. 1 walks away alive, quietly loaded down with the failures of everyone else. And for 1,500 years, on the most solemn day of the year, this was performed on purpose. An annual dramatization of a pattern that nobody at the time could have fully explained the point of. A story acted out over and over by people who did not yet know they were rehearsing. There is an old tradition attached to this ceremony that makes the picture even more vivid, and whether or not you take it literally, it tells you exactly what the ritual was supposed to mean to the people watching. According to that tradition, a strip of scarlet wool, a bright red thread, was tied to the goat before it was sent away, and another red thread was fastened somewhere at the temple. And the story went that when the guilt had truly been carried off and the day had done its work, that scarlet thread would turn white, bright red to clean white, a visible, physical picture of stains being washed out until nothing dark was left. It is, essentially, the oldest before and after image in the world, and the whole point of it was to say that guilt does not just get filed away or quietly ignored. It gets removed so completely that the color of the stain itself changes, and the destination mattered as much as the removal. The goat was not simply shooed off into the nearest field where it might wander back the following afternoon looking for its dinner, which would have rather undermined the whole ceremony. It was led far out, deep into harsh, dry, rocky country, a genuinely desolate place well beyond the edge of ordinary life, specifically so that it could never find its way home. That distance was the entire point. The guilt was not just forgiven in principle while staying uncomfortably close by. It was carried off physically to a place so remote it could not come back. And that idea of wrongdoing not merely pardoned but hauled away to somewhere it can never return from is one of the most quietly radical images in the whole ancient system. And it is sitting right there in the background of a chaotic morning in front of a Roman governor who has absolutely no idea he is starring in it. Now put the two scenes side by side and try not to get chills. In front of Pilate, you have two men. One of them is innocent, and he is going to be handed over to die. The other is genuinely guilty, loaded up with real crimes, actual insurrection, actual blood, and he is going to be released, sent away alive, walking free out into the city while another takes his place. One dies, one escapes carrying his own guilt. The ancient ritual with the two goats was not a quaint bit of religious housekeeping. It turns out to have been a rehearsal. And the morning in front of Pilate is opening night, except nobody in the crowd has read the script. And the man playing the role of the released guilty one has no idea he is standing inside the oldest metaphor in his own religion. And then there is the detail that pushes the whole thing from clever parallel into something that feels almost designed, and it is hiding in the villain's name. Barabbas. It sounds like just a name, the way Kevin sounds like just a name. But it is not a random collection of syllables. In the original language, Barabbas breaks down into Bar Abba, and Bar Abba means, quite literally, son of the Father. That is what his name means, son of the Father. So freeze the scene and really look at what is being offered. Pilate is holding up two men and asking the crowd to choose. And in a coincidence so pointed it barely deserves the word coincidence, both of them can be described as a son of the Father. One is a man literally named Son of the Father, a guilty son, an insurrectionist, someone who has thoroughly earned his sentence. The other is, according to the whole thrust of the story, the true Son of the Father, entirely innocent, who has earned nothing of the kind. The crowd is being asked, without having the faintest idea, to choose between two sons of the Father. And they pick the guilty one. It gets one layer deeper still because in some of the oldest surviving copies of the account, the prisoner is not simply called Barabbas, he is given a first name. And that first name in those manuscripts is Jesus, Jesus Barabbas, which means that if those readings are right, the crowd is standing in front of two men who share the exact same name and being asked to choose between them. Jesus, who is called Son of the Father, the guilty one, or Jesus, who is called the Anointed, the innocent one. Same name, opposite men, and they release the guilty Jesus so the innocent one can be condemned in his place. If that does not make the hair on your arms stand up a little, read it one more time. There is a name theologians have used for this pattern for centuries, and it is worth saying out loud because it is the engine humming under the entire story. They call it the Great Exchange. The innocent takes the place of the guilty so that the guilty can take the place of the innocent. And what makes Barabbas the perfect illustration is that he does absolutely nothing whatsoever to earn a single part of it. He does not argue his case, or repent on cue, or strike some clever last-minute bargain that tips the scales. He is simply sitting in a cell, braced for the worst, when he hears a mob outside roaring his name over and over. Picture the horror of that for a second, and then the whiplash, as he slowly works out that they are not baying for his blood at all. They are demanding his release. He is going home. And the entire reason, the only reason, is that somebody else is now walking out toward the execution ground carrying the weight that had his name written all over it. And that is what makes Barabbas the one figure in the whole account the storytellers seem to want you to climb inside, because the natural instinct is to sneer at that crowd, to sit safely on this side of the screen and think, well, obviously I would have chosen better. I would never have picked the insurrectionist over the innocent man. But the design of the scene quietly refuses to let you off that easily. In its logic, you are not the wise observer in the back row. You are Barabbas. You are the guilty son of the Father, fully expecting to face the consequences of your own actions, when a door swings open and, for reasons that have nothing to do with anything you have done, another name is called instead of yours, and you walk out into the daylight a free person. Barabbas is the one man who gets to watch the substitution happen in real time. Physically, no interpretation required, another human being hauling off the exact punishment measured for him. on his exact charge, in his exact place. Everyone else in the story has to work out the meaning of the swap. Barabbas just has to look, and the invitation for everyone watching is to notice which side of that trade they are standing on. One last thing worth flagging so we do not tangle our wires later. This entire scene, the two men, the guilty one released, the substitute handed over, all of it belongs to the machinery of that solemn day of atonement, the day of the two goats. That is one specific ancient festival with its own particular logic of guilt transferred onto a substitute and then carried far away. It is a day about cleansing, about wiping a slate, about taking the accumulated wrongdoing of a whole people and getting rid of it. And it is important to keep that lens clean because later, up on the hill itself, an entirely different festival is going to start echoing through the story, an older and even more famous one, built around a completely different image, a lamb rather than a goat, rescue from death rather than the removal of guilt. Two separate feasts, two separate pictures, and if you let them smear together, you lose the precision of both. So we are going to keep that second one carefully sealed off until we reach it, and for now leave the ghosts to do their own work without borrowing from the lamb. Just notice, in passing, how neatly the story keeps stacking these ancient patterns one on top of another, as if the whole thing had been quietly assembled from parts that were manufactured centuries apart. For now, hold on to just this. The crowd on that chaotic morning thought they were making a snap decision, a spur-of-the-moment shout in the heat of a tense and crowded festival. In reality, they were reenacting a ceremony older than the city they were standing in, a verdict whose exact shape had been rehearsed deliberately every single year for 15 centuries. The guilty son of the father walked away free. The true one did not. And that swap, the innocent stepping into the place marked for the guilty, is the very same swap we watched being quietly agreed to in the dark of the garden. Only now it has been dragged out into the daylight and made public in front of the whole shouting crowd on the road toward a hill we are just about to climb. So we climb. The road out of the city toward the execution ground was not a long one, but on this particular morning it must have felt endless, and if you freeze the frame anywhere along that route, you land on one of the most quietly loaded images in the entire account. An image so familiar from 1,000 paintings that almost nobody stops to ask what is actually going on. A man is carrying a piece of wood on his shoulders. That is the picture. Just a man and a beam. And packed into that single image are two separate threads, one reaching back a few verses and one reaching back the better part of 2,000 years, and both of them turn out to be doing far more work than the surface ever lets on. Start with the practical reality, because it is worth clearing up a misconception that every single film gets wrong. The popular image is of a man dragging an enormous, fully assembled cross, the whole T-shape, down the street on his back like some sort of grim item of flat-pack furniture. That is almost certainly not what happened. The Romans, who had turned this form of execution into a brutally efficient industry, generally kept the tall, upright post permanently fixed in the ground at the execution site, reused again and again, a kind of ghastly piece of civic infrastructure that never came down. What the condemned man actually carried was the crossbeam alone, the horizontal piece, which was still a punishingly heavy slab of timber, but nothing like the entire structure. He carried the beam to the post, not the whole thing from scratch, which, if you are keeping score, means the burden was still enormous, just enormous in a slightly more historically accurate way. And here's where the first thread pulls tight, because along that route something happens that the storytellers clearly thought was important enough to record with an oddly specific detail. At some point on the walk, the soldiers escorting the prisoner grab a man out of the watching crowd, a complete bystander, and force him to carry the beam the rest of the way. This was entirely within their power to do. The Roman military had a legal right, a nasty little piece of occupation law that let a soldier compel any provincial on the spot to carry his equipment or perform a task for a set distance, no argument permitted. It is the same principle behind that famous line about being forced to go 1 mile and choosing to go 2. So from the soldier's point of view, this was routine. See a strong-looking man in the crowd, point at him, and congratulations, he has just been volunteered for the least appealing job in the city. No interview process, no notice period, and absolutely no option to decline. The man they picked has a name, and the fact that we know his name at all is the first clue that something interesting is going on. He was called Simon, and he came from Cyrene, which was not some local village down the road. Cyrene was a city way over on the coast of North Africa, in what is now Libya, hundreds of miles away across the sea. Simon was, in other words, a foreigner, a pilgrim, who had almost certainly traveled a very long distance to be in the city for the festival, the ancient equivalent of flying halfway around the world for a once-in-a-lifetime religious trip. He had come for the holiday. He had come for the celebration, and instead, minding his own business somewhere along a crowded road, he got yanked out of the crowd by armed soldiers and handed the single heaviest and most horrifying object anyone would carry that day. Not exactly the pilgrimage highlight he had been picturing when he packed his bags. It is worth lingering on just how far Simon had come, because it says something about the crowd crammed into the city that week. Cyrene was home to a large and long-established community of his people, one of many such settlements scattered right across the ancient world, from Egypt to Rome to the far edges of the known map. For generations they had lived away from the homeland, keeping their traditions alive in foreign cities. And once a year, the great festivals drew them back in enormous numbers, pouring into the city from every direction, speaking a dozen different local dialects, reconnecting with a homeland many of them had only ever heard about. So the road Simon was walking was not some sleepy country lane. It was jammed with travelers from across 3 continents, a heaving, multilingual, once-a-year crush of humanity. And out of that entire ocean of faces, from a city on the African coast, it is the outsider, the visitor, the man with the unfamiliar accent from far away, who gets pulled in to carry the load. There is a pattern running quietly through this whole account, easy to miss, where the insiders keep missing the moment while the outsiders stumble straight into the middle of it. The local experts, the ones who had studied these texts their entire lives, are nowhere near the beam. The foreigner from Africa is the one holding it. Naturally. And then comes the detail that turns Simon from a nameless extra into someone the early readers clearly recognized, because the account does not just give us his name, it gives us the names of his 2 sons. It tells us that this Simon was the father of 2 men called Alexander and Rufus. Now stop and think about how strange that is. In a story racing toward its climax, in a scene where you would expect zero interest in the family tree of a random passerby, the writer pauses to tell us the names of the man's children. There's really only one good reason to do that. Those 2 sons, Alexander and Rufus, must have been people the original audience actually knew. Real, named, familiar figures in the early community. The sort of people where you could say, you know Rufus, his dad was the one who carried the beam, and everyone would nod. It is the ancient version of a footnote that says, yes, this really happened, and here's a family you can go and ask about it. What looks like a throwaway line is actually the storyteller quietly dropping his sources. There is even a tantalizing possibility tucked away in the later writings, because years afterward, in a letter sent to the community in the capital of the empire itself, someone passes along warm personal greetings to a man named Rufus, describing him as chosen and singled out for particular affection, and curiously greets Rufus's mother as well, calling her a mother to the writer too. Now, Rufus was not the rarest name going, so nobody can prove a thing. But it is at the very least a striking little coincidence that a family attached to the man who carried the beam should resurface, generations down the line, as respected members of the movement far away in the heart of Rome. If it is the same family, then the reluctant conscript from the African coast raised sons who ended up woven right into the life of the community at its very center, which would be a remarkable arc for a man whose entire involvement began with a soldier pointing at him in a crowd. From voluntold beam carrier to the father of a family that letters get addressed to. Not a bad legacy for someone who never asked to be in the story in the first place. So a foreigner from Africa, a man who had come to town purely as a spectator, becomes the one and only human being to physically share the load of that walk. And this is where the first meaning surfaces, meaning number 4 in our running count. And it is quietly enormous. Because not long before all this, the same man now walking ahead of Simon had said something that has since become one of the most quoted and least understood lines in the whole collection. He told his followers that if anyone wanted to come after him, they had to take up their cross and follow him. Take up your cross. We have flattened that phrase into a gentle motivational slogan, the sort of thing you put on a mug, meaning roughly put up with your minor inconveniences with a brave face. But in its original setting, it was not gentle at all. It was a shockingly grim image because everyone listening knew exactly what carrying a cross meant and where that walk ended. And here, on this road, that metaphor suddenly becomes brutally literal. Simon of Cyrene is the very first human being to physically pick up a cross and walk behind this man, the first person to do the thing in the flesh that the teaching described. And the beautiful, slightly uncomfortable irony is that he did it entirely against his will. Simon did not volunteer out of devotion. He was not moved by a stirring speech. He was conscripted at spear point, dragged into the most important walk in the story with no say in the matter whatsoever. The first person ever to literally take up the cross and follow did so grumbling, we can safely assume, and probably wondering why he had not just stayed home. Which is, if you sit with it, a strangely hopeful picture of how these things often work. The path does not always begin with a clean, heroic choice. Sometimes you get pulled into carrying something you never asked to carry, on a road you never planned to walk, and only much later does it turn out to have been the most significant thing you ever did. Simon reached down to shoulder a burden that was not his on behalf of a man he probably did not know, and ended up written into the story forever, with his kids named in the credits. Not a bad outcome for a man who was, technically, just trying to get to a festival. Now, that is the thread that reaches back a few verses. The second thread reaches back an almost absurd distance, thousands of years, to one of the oldest and most unsettling stories in the entire library. And once you see it lined up against this walk, it is very hard to unsee. To get there, we have to leave the road entirely and travel back to a story about a father, a son, and a mountain, one that had been told and retold for countless generations before anyone in this crowd was born. The story goes like this. A man named Abraham, already old, finally has the son he had waited his entire life for, a boy named Isaac, the child of a promise, the one everything depended on. And then Abraham is asked to do the single, most horrifying thing a parent could be asked to do. He is told to take that son, his only son, the one he loves, and travel to a specific mountain in a region called Moriah, and there offer him up as a sacrifice. It is a genuinely brutal test, the kind that has troubled readers and thinkers for millennia, and we are not going to pretend it is anything other than deeply hard. But hold the discomfort for a moment and just watch the mechanics of the scene, because the physical staging of it is where the parallel lives. Abraham and Isaac travel for 3 days to reach the mountain. When they arrive at the foot of it, Abraham takes the wood that has been gathered for the offering, the wood on which the sacrifice will be burned. And here is the line that should make the hair on your neck stand up. He does not carry the wood himself. He loads it onto the back of his son. Isaac, the son, carries the wood for his own sacrifice up the mountain on his own shoulders. Let that settle. A beloved only son walking up a hill, carrying on his back the very wood on which he is about to be laid down. If that image feels eerily familiar, it should, because you were looking at its twin about 4 paragraphs ago. A son, a hill, the wood for his own death, carried on his own shoulders, up the slope by the one who is going to be offered on it. And here's a detail about Isaac that the paintings almost always get wrong because they tend to show him as a small, helpless child. He was not. To carry a load of firewood large enough to consume an entire offering up the side of a mountain, Isaac had to have been a strong young man, easily old enough and fit enough to grasp what was happening and, crucially, to resist it. His father Abraham by this stage was extremely old. If Isaac had wanted to refuse, to struggle, to simply walk faster than a man of that age could follow, he could have done it without much difficulty, which means the most haunting part of the scene is not that a child was overpowered, it is that a grown, capable young man appears to have gone along with it. He carried the wood himself, he climbed the hill himself, he asked his questions, received an answer that cannot possibly have set his mind at ease, and kept walking anyway. There is a willingness in the old story that the child version scrubs out completely, and it is precisely that willingness, the son shouldering his own wood not by force but by consent, that makes the echo on this later hill ring so loudly. And do not skate past the 3 days. Abraham receives the terrible instruction, and then has to travel for 3 long days with his son before ever reaching the mountain. 3 days of walking beside a boy he believes he is about to lose. 3 days of carrying that knowledge in silence while making ordinary small talk about the journey. which is a kind of quiet agony the story does not spell out but absolutely expects you to feel. In the way the old storytellers understood it, those 3 days were a sort of death already, a stretch in which, in his own heart, Abraham had effectively given his son up for gone, which is why some of the most ancient readings treat the moment on the mountain as a kind of receiving him back. A son as good as dead for 3 days and then, at the very last, handed back alive. Hold that number gently for now. 3 days. A giving up, followed by a coming back. It is going to matter enormously before we are finished, though we are nowhere near ready to open that particular box just yet. And this is meaning number 5, and it is one of those things that, once pointed out, seems almost too neat to be accidental. The account of Abraham and Isaac was ancient scripture, memorized and recited for generation after generation, long before anyone dreamed up the specific method of execution being carried out on this particular hill. Nobody writing that old story could have engineered it to match a Roman practice that would not exist for the better part of 2,000 years. And yet the shape is identical. The beloved son carrying the instrument of his own death up a hill to the place of sacrifice. It is the same picture drawn twice with an enormous gulf of time in between, and the second drawing is a photograph of the first. The parallel gets sharper still when you look at where these two mountains sit. The region of Moriah, where Abraham was sent, is, by long tradition, tied to the very area that would later become the beating heart of the nation, the location that generations afterward would regard as the holiest ground they had, the place set apart above all others for sacrifice and worship. And the hill where the beam was being carried on this morning was just outside that same city, a stone's throw in the grand scheme of things from that ancient sacred high ground. The traditions that grew up around these stories linked them deliberately, treating Moriah and this execution hill as points on a single line, two sacrifices staged on connected soil, separated by a vast stretch of history but bound together by the same theme. The geography itself seems to rhyme. One father led his son up a hill of sacrifice and at the last possible second did not have to go through with it. On this morning, a very different scene is playing out on strikingly similar ground, and the ending this time will be different. Now there is a crucial part of the Abraham and Isaac story that everyone always wants to jump straight to, the part with the dramatic last-second rescue and what appears in the thicket to take Isaac's place. And we are deliberately going to leave that alone for now. Not because it does not matter, but because it matters so much that it deserves its own moment. And that moment is coming right at the very end of all this, where it belongs. So for now, we are simply going to freeze the frame on the image itself before any rescue and let it hang there. The sun, the wood, the shoulders, the uphill walk. There is a question Isaac asks his father on that climb, an innocent, devastating question about where exactly the offering is going to come from. And the answer his father gives is one of the great loaded lines of the whole tradition. But we are going to hold that thread and pick it back up when the time is right. For now, just notice what the wood alone has told us. Even the raw timber on the shoulders before a single word is spoken on the hill is quoting a story thousands of years old. The beam is a citation. The walk is a rerun. And whoever assembled this account clearly wanted you to feel the echo. So the frame we paused on, one man and a beam, turns out to be holding two stories at once, layered on top of each other like a double exposure. On the surface, a foreigner named Simon, hauled out of a crowd, becoming the first person to literally do the thing the teaching had described, carrying a cross behind the very man who first said the words. Underneath that, an ancient son on a distant mountain carrying the wood of his own offering up a slope, in an image so old it predated the very method of execution it seemed to forecast. 2 men, 2 loads of wood, 2 uphill walks, separated by thousands of years, and yet the second is unmistakably tracing the outline of the first. The teaching about taking up a cross was not improvised on the spot. The picture of a son carrying his own wood was not improvised on the spot either. Both were sitting there, waiting long before this particular morning, and on this one stretch of road they quietly clicked together, which is more or less the whole thesis of this slow walk through the scene, that almost nothing here is as spontaneous as it looks, and that the plain wooden beam on a man's shoulders, of all the unlikely things, is one of the oldest quotations in the entire book. So the wood has been carried one way or another up the slope, and now the little procession arrives at the top, at the actual spot, and the spot itself has a name, and the name is our next stop because it is the sort of detail people breeze straight past on their way to the main event, never noticing that the ground has a story of its own. The place is called Golgotha. You may also know it by another name, Calvary. But these are just two doors into the same word, one coming through the original local language and one arriving later through Latin. And both of them mean the exact same slightly grisly thing. Golgotha means the place of the skull. Calvary is simply the Latin word for skull wearing a different coat. So the hill where all of this happens is, quite literally, called Skull Hill, which is a genuinely unnerving name for a location and not one you would pick for, say, a family picnic spot. And notice where the Skull Hill actually sat, because the placement was not accidental either. Execution grounds like this one were deliberately positioned outside the city walls, never inside them, and usually right beside a busy road where the greatest possible number of people would be forced to file past. The grim logic behind that was, of all things, advertising. The entire purpose of this form of punishment, from the occupying power's point of view, was deterrence. A public billboard of exactly what happens to anyone who steps out of line, planted precisely where the foot traffic was heaviest, so that nobody could plausibly claim they had not got the message. So this was not some hidden, discreet corner tucked out of view. It was a raised, exposed roadside spot, chosen specifically for visibility, with crowds streaming past all day long, which means that whatever meaning was hanging in the air over this hill was not sealed away in a back room somewhere. It was staged, unavoidably, in the open, on the busiest route in the region, in front of an audience that had, as we have seen, arrived from all over the world. The empire intended it as a blunt warning to keep the population in line. It ended up being the most heavily attended sermon in history, delivered from a hill nobody could look away from. Now, why on earth would a place be called the place of the skull? This is where it gets interesting and where we have to be careful and honest about what is solid and what is tradition, because the two get blended together constantly and it matters which is which. On the practical side, there are a couple of down-to-earth theories. Some suggest the hill was simply shaped from a certain angle like a skull, a rounded rocky dome with features that vaguely suggested a face, the way people see shapes in clouds. Others point out, more grimly, that this was a well-established execution site, a place with a certain reputation, and leave it at that. Those are the ordinary, feet-on-the-ground explanations, and they may well be part of the answer. But there is a much older and much stranger tradition attached to the name, and this is the one worth slowing down for, with a very clear label on it. This is tradition, a story handed down in the early community, not something written plainly in the core text. So take it as what it is, a piece of ancient interpretation rather than reported fact. And the tradition says this. It says that the reason the hill is called the place of the skull is because of whose skull is buried there. According to this old belief, passed along by some of the earliest teachers, the very first man, Adam, the one from the garden at the beginning of everything, was buried at this exact spot. His skull, so the story goes, rested in the ground beneath that hill, which would make the place of the skull mean, very specifically, the place of Adam's skull. The grave of the first human, sitting directly under the site where all of this was now unfolding. It is worth being straight about where this idea came from so that nobody mistakes a beautiful legend for a documented fact. The notion that the first man lay buried beneath this specific hill was put forward by several influential early teachers, and it caught on precisely because it was so satisfying, because it closed a loop that people badly wanted closed. There is no hard evidence for it whatsoever, no receipt, no ancient marker in the ground reading first human buried here. It is folklore in the best and richest sense of the word, a story the community told itself to give shape to a truth it felt in its bones, that the rescue somehow had to reach all the way back to the very first casualty. Some later versions of the legend went further still, imagining streams of significance running down to revive the buried ancestor, piling detail upon detail, which is simply what happens when a good story gets loved for a very long time. So treat the buried skull as a picture rather than a police report. But do not wave it away either, because even as pure symbol, it captures something the plainer texts are genuinely reaching for, which is that whatever this hill accomplished, it was aimed not at the surface of the problem, but at its oldest, deepest root. And whether or not you take that tradition literally, and plenty of careful people do not, it produced an image so powerful that it embedded itself permanently into how this scene has been pictured ever since. If you look closely at old religious paintings and carvings of this hill, especially in the Eastern Christian tradition, you will notice something you might have assumed was just morbid decoration. Down at the very base of the cross, tucked at the foot of the wood, there is very often a small skull, sometimes with a couple of bones. Most people glance at it and file it under generic death imagery, a spooky little reminder that this is a place of dying. But it is not generic at all. That skull has a name. It is Adam. The artists were deliberately placing the skull of the first man directly beneath the cross, and once you know what you're looking at, you cannot unsee it. And every one of those images is suddenly telling a story far more specific than mere decoration. So why did this image grip people so hard that it survived for centuries in stone and paint? Because of an idea running right through the later writings, an idea that sets up the whole of humanity as a story of two men, two representatives, standing at the two ends of the whole thing. The first man, Adam, and then, described centuries later, a second figure explicitly called the last Adam, a kind of do-over of the human project, a second attempt at what the first one was supposed to be. And the two are set up as deliberate mirror images of one another, point for point, in reverse. It is one of the most elegant patterns in the entire collection, and the hill with the buried skull sits right at the center of it. Watch how precisely the two halves line up. The first man's story began in a garden, a place of life and abundance, and it went wrong because of a tree, and an act of reaching out and taking, of grasping, for something that was not his to grasp, a moment of disobedience that, in the logic of the story, let death into the world for everyone who came after. That is the opening act of the human race, and it ends with a curse, with exile, with the ground itself turning hostile, and with mortality becoming the default setting for every human being ever since. One man, one tree, one wrong choice, and the whole species inherits the consequences. It is a story about how something broken at the very root spreads outward through everything that grows from it. Now put the second man beside him on this hill and watch the entire thing run backwards. Where the first story had a garden, this one has a barren hill of execution. Where the first had a tree of temptation, this one has a different kind of tree entirely, a rough wooden beam. Where the first turned on an act of grasping, of taking what was forbidden, this one turns on the exact opposite, an act of giving, of laying down, of refusing to grasp at self-preservation. Where the first was disobedience, this is obedience carried all the way to the end. And where the first let death in, this, according to the whole thrust of the account, is the moment that starts to shut the door on it. The first Adam reached up and took, and death came in. The second Adam stretched out and gave, and the curse begins to unwind. Same species, same problem, opposite solution, staged on a hill that, if the old tradition holds, sits directly on top of the grave of the man whose story is being reversed. And it is the detail of the wood, of the tree, that ties the two halves together most tightly, because wood keeps turning up at every single hinge of this whole sweeping story. Something went wrong at a tree, right at the very beginning. The rescue, thousands of years later, is fixed to another piece of wood on this hill. And in between, if you have been paying attention, the wood has appeared over and over, the timber, a sun carried up a mountain, the beam, a foreigner carried up a road. It is almost as though the entire account has been stitched together with the same material, the same humble substance surfacing at every turning point, quietly insisting that all these scenes belong to one connected story. The instrument of the disaster and the instrument of the rescue are cut from the same stuff. What broke things was wood. What is now being used to mend them is wood. The trouble opened at a tree, and the answer, in the logic the writers are reaching for, closes at one. There is one more layer to that title, the last Adam, worth drawing out, because it is doing something bigger than a tidy comparison. Calling the second man the last Adam is a way of announcing that an entirely new version of the human race is beginning here. A fresh line, a second run at being human that does not have the same fatal flaw baked into it from the outset. The first Adam was the head of the old humanity, the family line that inherited the crack in the foundation. The last Adam in this reading becomes the head of a new one, and everybody who attaches themselves to him gets counted into that second family rather than the first. It is the difference between being defined by where the species originally started and being defined by where it is now being restarted. So the scene on this hill is not merely undoing an old mistake in the abstract. It is, according to the whole design, the founding moment of a new kind of human being, planted directly on top of the grave of the old one. The first family tree runs out at a skull in the ground. A second one begins on the wood above it. And this is where that little skull at the foot of the cross stops being decoration and becomes the whole point in miniature. Picture it. The second man, the last Adam, lifted up on the wood, and beneath him in the ground, the skull of the first man, the one whose single choice broke everything. And down the wood, according to the image the artists were reaching for, runs a line connecting the two, the consequences of the second man's act traveling downward, reaching all the way to the buried remains of the first. The redemption in this picture does not float around in the abstract. It travels down to the ground, to the root, to the literal skull of the first person who ever got it wrong. It is the story reaching back to its own beginning and dealing with the problem at the source, rather than just patching over the surface. Whatever went wrong at the very start, in the garden, with the first man, is being addressed at the very same spot, on the hill named after his skull. Even the dirt under this hill is preaching a sermon, and it has been preaching it silently for as long as anyone had been telling the story of the man in the garden. That is the astonishing thing about this name that everybody walks past. Golgotha is not just a grim label for an unpleasant place. In the way the tradition reads it, the location is a deliberate piece of storytelling, a stage set chosen so precisely that the very rock it stands on continues the message. Where the story of humanity began, the tradition says, is where it gets rewritten. The place of the skull, the grave of the first, becomes the platform for the last. And that is the sort of detail that turns a familiar scene inside out, because suddenly the setting is not just where the story happens. The setting is part of the story. So we have climbed the hill, we know its name, and we know the quiet claim buried underneath it. The wood has been carried up, echoing a sun on a mountain thousands of years before. The ground has been named, echoing the man in the garden at the very beginning. And now the procession stops, and the scene shifts down from the top of the hill and the great sweep of ancient history to something much smaller and much more human, happening right at the foot of the cross. Because while all of this enormous meaning hangs in the air above them, the soldiers who did the actual work have already lost interest in the theology entirely. They have a more pressing matter on their hands, a small, grubby, entirely ordinary problem, and they are about to solve it in a way that, without any of them realizing, ticks off yet another line written down 1,000 years in advance. They are crouching in the dirt, and they are reaching for a set of dice. Down in the dirt at the base of the wood, then, while all that enormous meaning hangs overhead, 4 ordinary soldiers are getting on with the least glamorous part of the job. Crucifixion, for the men assigned to carry it out, was not some solemn cosmic event. It was a shift. A grim, routine, deeply unpleasant shift, the sort of duty you drew when your name came up on the roster, and like workers everywhere stuck with a miserable task, these men were mostly interested in the small perks that came with it. And the standard perk of an execution detail was simple. Whatever the condemned man had on him, his clothing, his few possessions, became the property of the soldiers who did the work. Think of it as a rather bleak version of a tip. So while the theology of the ages is playing out above their heads, the men at the foot of the cross are doing what people have always done at the edges of a tragedy, which is quietly working out who gets to keep the good stuff. The account tells us there were 4 of them, and it tells us they split the clothing into 4 shares, 1 apiece, which was presumably the fairest way to divide up a wardrobe that was not exactly extensive to begin with. A cloak here, a belt there, sandals, a head covering, the ordinary layers a man of that time and place would have worn. Nothing valuable, nothing anyone would remember. 4 soldiers, 4 piles, job nearly done. Except there was one item that would not cooperate with the plan, and it is that single stubborn garment that turns this grubby little scene into something worth stopping on. The problem was the tunic, the inner garment worn next to the skin. When the soldiers went to divide it, they hit a snag, because this particular tunic was made in an unusual way. It was, as the account carefully notes, not stitched together from separate pieces of cloth the way ordinary garments were. It was woven in a single piece from the top all the way down with no seams anywhere. And that presented the soldiers with a genuine little dilemma, because their default method for splitting a garment 4 ways would have been to simply tear it into pieces, which is not elegant but does at least give everyone a fair share of the fabric. You cannot do that with a seamless garment though, or rather you can, but the moment you rip it, you have turned one decent piece of clothing into 4 worthless rags. So the soldiers, displaying a flash of practical wisdom that they were presumably not being paid for, decided not to tear it. Instead, they gambled for it. They cast lots, rolled the dice, whatever the ancient version of drawing straws happened to be. And the winner took the whole intact tunic, which means somewhere in history there was a soldier who went home from the worst workday imaginable with a very nice, slightly used, one-of-a-kind woven shirt, and probably never thought about it again. Now, on the surface, this is nothing. A footnote. Soldiers being soldiers, squeezing a small bonus out of a bad day. But the detail about the tunic being seamless, woven whole from the top, is the sort of thing that made anyone deeply familiar with the old traditions sit up sharply, because there was one very specific, very significant garment in the entire culture that was famously made exactly that way. A single piece of woven cloth without seams top to bottom, and that garment was the robe of the high priest. The historian who documented the customs of the time in loving detail describes the high priest's tunic as being precisely this. Not 2 pieces sewn together, but one long garment woven as a single seamless whole. It was a distinctive, recognizable, deliberately special way of making a robe, reserved for the man who held the highest sacred office in the nation, the one figure permitted to enter the most sacred space and stand once a year between the people and the divine. And this is meaning number 7, and it is quietly stunning once you see it. The man hanging on that cross is dressed underneath everything in the garment of a high priest, not by accident of costume, but as a silent statement about who he actually is. Because the whole of the later reflection on this scene lands on exactly this idea, that this man was not merely a victim of an execution, but was himself functioning as the true and final high priest, the one who does what every high priest before him had only ever pointed toward. A priest in the old system was the middleman, the one who stood between people and God and offered the sacrifice on their behalf. And the strange, staggering thing about this particular figure is that he is both at once. He is the priest making the offering, and he is the offering being made. The one who presents the sacrifice and the sacrifice itself folded into a single person, hanging from a single piece of wood, wearing a single seamless robe. The soldiers had no idea. They just saw a shirt too nice to rip. But they were, without the faintest clue, gambling at the feet of the true high priest for the very garment that marked him as one. And there is a sharp little irony folded into that seamless robe that cuts even deeper once you know one more rule about the high priest's wardrobe. The office came with strict regulations, and one of them concerned what the high priest was forbidden to do to his garments. Under the old law, he was specifically prohibited from tearing his sacred robes, even in grief. Where an ordinary person might rip their clothing as a raw, physical expression of mourning or horror, the high priest was to keep his intact, his vestments a picture of an office that was not supposed to be broken. Now set that beside a scene that had played out only hours earlier at the nighttime hearing, when the acting high priest of the day, hearing exactly the answer he had been fishing for, dramatically tore his own robes in a theatrical show of outrage and declared the case closed. The man holding the earthly office, the one forbidden to tear his garments, tore them anyway, in the very act of condemning the man now hanging on the hill. And that condemned man wears, beneath his stripped outer layers, a seamless robe that by its very construction cannot be torn, that the soldiers themselves declined to rip because ripping it would only ruin it. The false high priest rends his robe to destroy the true one. The true high priest wears the robe that will not be rent. You could not stage that contrast more precisely if you sat down with a pen and planned it, which one begins to suspect somebody did. And here's a smaller thread we are going to touch and then deliberately leave alone because it belongs somewhere else. That business of the soldiers dividing the clothes and then casting lots for the one piece they would not tear happens to match, almost word for word, a line written down roughly 1,000 years earlier in a song of the old poet King. A line about enemies dividing up a sufferer's garments among themselves and throwing lots to decide who gets the clothing. It is an eerily exact hit, right down to the specific 2-part action, the dividing and then the gambling. But that single line is only one fragment of a much larger and frankly astonishing text, a whole poem that reads like a first-hand report of everything happening on this hill. And we are going to give that its own dedicated moment a little further on because it deserves far more than a passing mention here. For now, just file it away. The dice in the dirt are quoting poetry. We will come back to the poem. While the soldiers are occupied with their impromptu game, look up, because there is one more object in this frame that everybody has seen 1,000 times, and almost nobody reads properly. Above the condemned man's head, fixed to the wood, there is a small board, a notice, and it is there because Roman executions came with a label. The custom was to post the charge, the reason for the punishment, so that passers-by could read what this person had done to deserve it, a sort of public caption spelling out the crime for maximum deterrent effect. Usually, it was something brief and damning. In this case, the governor himself dictated what it should say, and what he chose to write was not a crime at all, but a title. It named the man, and it called him a king. And then, in a detail that is easy to skim past, but is doing an enormous amount of quiet work, the governor had it written out in 3 different languages. 3 languages, not one. And these were not 3 languages chosen at random from a hat. They were, in effect, the 3 great languages of that entire world, each one carrying its own kind of authority. There was the local sacred language, the tongue of religion and scripture and the temple, the language in which the people prayed. There was the language of the empire, the official tongue of Roman law and power and administration, the language of the people actually running the show. And there was the common international language of the day, the shared tongue of trade and learning and culture that educated people across the whole region used to talk to one another, the closest thing that world had to a universal language. Religion, empire, and culture, the 3 spheres that between them covered just about everyone who mattered and everyone who did not. And a notice written in all 3 could be read by essentially anybody who walked past, no matter where they came from or which world they belonged to. Which produces meaning number 8, and it carries a delicious irony. The governor did not write that sign as a proclamation of faith. He wrote it, as far as we can tell, partly as cold legal procedure and partly as a deliberate jab at the local leadership who had backed him into this corner. A little bureaucratic revenge dressed up as a formality. His intention was mundane, possibly even spiteful. And yet, by insisting on all 3 languages, he accidentally turned a criminal charge into the first genuinely international announcement of who this man was. In 3 languages, for the whole world to read, posted above the most public execution imaginable, on the busiest road in the region, was a single message. This man is a king. The empire meant it sarcastically. History has read it rather differently. It was, without anyone intending it, the first worldwide headline, published in every relevant language at once, by a man who thought he was just filling out the paperwork. And the governor, having written it, then dug in about it with a stubbornness he had shown at no other point in the entire proceedings. Because the local leaders read the sign, did not care for the wording one bit, and came to him with a correction. "Do not write that he is a king," they said. "Write instead that he merely claimed to be one." A small edit, grammatically speaking, but an enormous one in meaning, the difference between a statement of fact and a report of a boast. And the governor, who had spent the whole morning caving to their pressure, folding at every turn, washing his hands of decisions rather than making them, suddenly and inexplicably refused to budge. "What I have written," he told them, "I have written. Full stop. End of discussion." It was, without question, the most decisive thing he did all day. And it was over the wording of a sign, the one moment this endlessly compromising official finally planted his feet and would not be moved. He did it to keep the truth carved exactly as it was. Naturally, he had no idea that is what he was doing. He thought he was winning a petty argument. He was actually refusing, on principle, to soften the one line that mattered most. Those words, incidentally, went on to have a very long afterlife. The opening letters of that 3-part title in the imperial language became one of the most reproduced inscriptions in all of history, stamped and painted and carved onto countless depictions of this scene ever since. A little cluster of letters that most people today recognize instantly without having the faintest idea what they actually stand for, which is its own quiet joke. A governor scribbles out a spiteful caption to needle some local officials, and 2,000 years later his exact wording, shrunk down to a handful of initials, is still hanging over the same scene in homes and galleries all over the world. He got the last word after all, just not remotely in the way he had in mind. So step back and take in the whole picture at the foot of the cross. Men rolling dice for a dead man's shirt, not knowing it marks him as a priest. A notice nailed overhead, meant as mockery, accidentally proclaiming him king to the entire world in every language that counted. A stubborn official defending the truth for entirely the wrong reasons. Not one of these people is trying to make a point. The soldiers want a bonus. The governor wants the argument to end. And yet every grubby, self-interested, administrative little act somehow lines up perfectly with a design none of them can see. Even the leftover clothing and the legal fine print are somehow on message. Now lift your attention from the base of the cross to the man himself, because there is a moment involving something offered to him to drink, and it takes us straight back to an image we set up right at the very beginning in the dark of the garden. You will remember the whole scene turned on the idea of a cup that had to be drunk all the way down, with nothing left in the bottom and nothing skipped. That was a metaphor at the time, a figure of speech for the ordeal ahead. But here on the hill, that cup very nearly becomes a literal object, because on two separate occasions during these hours, something is actually lifted to his lips to drink, and the two drinks could not be more different in what they mean. The first drink comes early, and it is, of all things, an act of mercy. There was a custom, apparently a small tradition of compassion extended even to the condemned, of offering a person about to endure this kind of death a particular mixture of wine blended with a bitter substance, a drug, a crude painkiller of the ancient world. The idea was to dull the senses, to take the edge off, to make an unbearable thing fractionally less unbearable. It was, essentially, the closest thing that era had to anesthetic, a rough and ready sedative offered as a last small kindness. There is an old tradition that this merciful mixture was not the soldier's idea at all, but was quietly provided by a group of charitable women from the city who made it their business to ease the passing of the condemned in whatever small way they could, offering this dulling drink as an act of pure compassion to men the rest of the world had already written off. Whether or not that tradition pins down the exact source, it fits the character of the gesture perfectly, because the gesture was unmistakably one of kindness. This was the mercy on the table, the one softening available in an otherwise merciless situation, extended even to those in the process of being executed. And that is exactly what makes the refusal so striking, because he was not turning down a torment, he was turning down a comfort, the single small comfort anyone on that whole hill had thought to offer him. And by every reasonable expectation, a man in his position would take it. Of course he would, anyone would. Given the chance to blunt even a fraction of what was coming, who on earth would say no? He tasted it, the account says, and then he turned it down. He would not drink it. And that refusal is meaning number 9, and it connects directly back to that cup from the garden, because the whole point, established under the olive trees, was that this cup had to be drained completely, right down to the bitter dregs, with nothing left unfinished and nothing avoided. To accept the painkiller would have been to skip part of it, to numb his way through a portion of the very thing he had come to drink to the bottom. And so, in a decision that is quietly one of the most staggering in the whole account, he refuses the mercy, not because there is any virtue in suffering for its own sake, but because he had already resolved back in the dark to go through the entire thing fully present, fully aware, holding nothing back and dodging nothing. He turns down the one thing on offer that would have made it easier, because easier was never the point. He came to finish the cup, and you cannot finish a cup by pouring half of it out. And as with nearly everything else on this hill, this exact moment had been written down long before. In another of the ancient songs, a suffering figure describes his tormentors giving him something bitter and poisonous for food, and in his thirst, offering him sour, vinegary wine to drink. Bitterness for food and sour wine for thirst. Both of those show up here, at the cross, in the drinks offered to the man on the wood, matching a line composed centuries earlier by someone describing his own anguish, never dreaming it would be reenacted in such precise detail. The menu at this execution, if you can bear to call it that, had been written down in advance. Which brings us to the second drink, and specifically to the strange little detail of how it was delivered, because this is where the scene reaches out and grabs one more ancient thread that most people miss entirely. Later, near the end, the man says he is thirsty, and this time a drink is offered, and this time he takes it. A taste of the ordinary sour wine the soldiers had on hand. Fine, unremarkable. Except for the method of delivery. They soaked a sponge in the wine, and to lift it up to his mouth, since he was raised off the ground, they fixed the sponge to the end of a plant stalk and reached up with it. And one of the accounts is oddly specific about which plant that stalk came from. It was hyssop, a small, humble, shrubby herb. And of all the things you could reach for to make an improvised drinking implement, the fact that the account bothers to name this particular plant is a flashing signal to anyone who knows what hyssop meant. Because hyssop was not just any old weed growing by the roadside. Hyssop had a very specific, very sacred job in the old traditions, and it appears at precisely the moments that matter most. This is meaning number 10. Go all the way back to the night the whole nation was founded. The night of the great deliverance, when the people were instructed to mark their homes so that death would pass over them and leave them untouched. The instruction was to take the blood of a lamb and apply it to the frames around their doors. And the specific tool they were told to use to do the applying, the brush, if you like, was a bunch of hyssop. Hyssop was the applicator, the thing you dipped and used to mark the doorway on that founding night of rescue. And beyond that founding moment, hyssop kept its role as the instrument of purification, the plant used in the rituals of cleansing, so much so that when the old poet king begged to be made clean again after a great failure, the image he reached for was being cleansed with hyssop until he was pure. So sit with the strangeness of it. At this execution, the tool that happens to be used to lift a drink to the lips of the dying man is the exact plant that, in the deepest traditions of his people, was the instrument of both rescue and cleansing. The brush that marked the doorways on the night death passed over, the plant that made the unclean clean. It turns up here at the foot of this cross, doing the most ordinary job imaginable, holding up a sponge. There is even a small practical puzzle tucked into that choice of plant, because hyssop is not a tall or sturdy thing. It is a low, bushy little herb, hardly the obvious tool for lifting a sponge up to a man raised off the ground, and careful readers have scratched their heads over the mechanics of it for a very long time. Some suggest the crosses stood a good deal lower than the towering versions in the paintings. Others that the sponge was fixed onto a longer stalk with only a sprig of hyssop attached, and the discussion rumbles quietly on. But the awkwardness is almost the point. If someone were simply inventing a convenient prop, they would reach for an obviously practical object, a long reed, a pole, anything but a short herb famous for something else entirely. The very impracticality of the detail is what suggests it was remembered rather than made up. Somebody recalled the specific plant, inconvenient as it was, precisely because the specific plant was the thing that carried the meaning. And the mere presence of it, named so deliberately, is like a quiet flag planted in the ground, hinting that what is happening on this hill is not just an execution, but the real thing that all those older rescues and cleansings had only ever been rehearsals for. There is a much larger version of this idea waiting for us further along, a whole cluster of connections around that founding night of deliverance that we are deliberately keeping sealed up for now so we do not spoil it. For the moment, just notice the plant. Even the twig they used to give him a drink was a citation, and a loaded one. The thirst was real, so was the hint hidden in the herb. Now let us turn finally to the company he was keeping up there, because he was not alone on that hill. He was crucified in the middle of a group of 3, with a condemned man on either side of him, 2 others facing the same end at the same time. The accounts describe these 2 as criminals, bandits, the kind of violent troublemakers the authorities executed in batches. And it is worth remembering that only a short time earlier we watched a crowd choose to release exactly that sort of man, an insurrectionist, in place of the one now hanging between these 2. There is a strong possibility, in fact, that the center cross, the one now occupied by the innocent man, had originally been prepared for the guilty one who walked free, which would mean he is not just dying in that man's place in some abstract sense, but quite literally on the cross measured for him, flanked by the sort of company that man would have kept. The substitution we traced earlier is not floating in the realm of theology. It may be nailed down to the exact piece of wood, and the 2 men on either side, though sharing the identical fate, do 2 completely opposite things with the little time they have left, and the contrast between them is one of the sharpest in the entire story. One of them, even in his final agony, joins in the mockery. He sneers, throws the same taunt the crowds below are throwing, challenges the man in the middle to save himself and them while he is at it, all bitterness and scorn right to the end. And there is a terrible accidental truth buried inside that particular jeer, because it was being flung all around the hill in different forms, the same basic sneer over and over, that this man had rescued others yet somehow could not rescue himself. The mockers meant it as airtight proof that he was a fraud. Look at him, they were saying, utterly helpless, unable to do for his own skin the very thing he supposedly did for everyone else. But turn that sentence over, and it quietly becomes the exact opposite of an insult. He could not save himself in that moment precisely because he was in the middle of saving others, and the two were mutually exclusive by design. To climb down off the wood and prove the crowd wrong would have meant abandoning the entire reason he was up on it in the first place. The one act that would have silenced every mocker was the one act that would have drained the whole thing of its meaning. So the taunt meant to expose him as powerless was, read correctly, a flawless description of the most deliberate decision in the story. He does not save himself. That was never the failure. That was the point. The other one, though, does something remarkable. He first rebukes his fellow criminal, pointing out the obvious, that the two of them are getting what their actions earned, while the man between them has done nothing wrong at all. And then he turns his head toward the middle cross and, with what little strength he has left, makes a simple, almost unbearably humble request. He does not demand rescue, he does not bargain, he simply asks to be remembered, to be kept in mind when this strange king comes into whatever kingdom he was talking about. That is the entire ask, remember me. And the reply he gets is meaning number 11, and it detonates the entire notion of who gets to be saved and how. Because the man in the middle does not say maybe. He does not say we will see how you do. He does not hand over a list of requirements, a probationary period, a set of boxes to tick first. He tells the dying criminal, immediately and without qualification, that this very day the two of them will be together in paradise. Today. Not eventually, not pending review. Today. And stop for a second and really register who is receiving this promise, because it is astonishing. The first human being ever personally, explicitly promised a place in paradise by this man, out of everyone across the whole story, is not a devoted follower, not a lifelong holy man, not a scholar who got every detail of the law correct. It is a convicted criminal, a man being justly executed for real crimes, in the final hour of a life that, by his own admission, had gone badly wrong. That is who gets the first guaranteed spot. A guilty man, out of options, at the very last moment. And the particular word he chooses for the place he promises is worth pausing on, because it is not a vague, general term for the afterlife. The word we translate as paradise originally meant something very concrete. An enclosed garden, a walled and protected park of the sort ancient kings planted, a place of order and beauty and abundance sealed off from the harsh wilderness outside. And it is the very same word the old translators had reached for centuries earlier to describe one specific location, the garden at the very beginning of everything, the lush and perfect place the first man was driven out of when the whole story first went wrong. So when a dying criminal is told he will be in paradise this very day, the promise is not merely a reservation in some abstract heaven. In the deepest resonance of the word, it is an invitation back into the garden. The place humanity was locked out of at the start is being quietly reopened, and the first one led back through the gate is not a hero or a holy man, but a guilty one with hours left to live. It is the same move we keep watching this story make, circling all the way back to its own beginning, and this time opening the door that was slammed shut in the opening act. And notice what he actually did to receive it, because it is almost nothing, and that nothing is the whole point. He had no time left to fix his life, no opportunity to undo his crimes, no chance to perform a single good deed to balance the books. He could not join anything, attend anything, complete anything, or prove himself over the long haul. He had, at most, a few hours, most of them unimaginably painful, and no ability to do anything with his body at all. All he managed in the end was to turn his head, recognize something true about the man beside him, and ask. That was it. He turned and he asked, and it was enough, which is a genuinely scandalous idea, one that has troubled the bookkeepers and the box tickers ever since, because it suggests that the thing being offered here was never actually for sale in the first place, never something you earned by piling up enough good behavior to qualify. If a dying criminal with a resume of crimes and a few hours to live could receive it complete and in full, simply by turning and asking, then it was never about the resume at all. It was, from the start, a gift, handed to whoever would simply reach out and take it, no credentials required and no time to acquire any. There is a second layer to these two men, though, beyond what they did, and it lives in the simple geometry of the scene. The man was placed in the middle, deliberately, with a criminal on each side. He was, in the most literal physical arrangement, positioned among lawbreakers, counted as one of them, slotted into the lineup of the guilty as though he belonged there. And that exact situation, being numbered among the wrongdoers, treated and processed and executed as one of the criminal class, had been foreseen in the writings of one of the old prophets, in a passage describing a servant who would be counted alongside transgressors, lumped in with the guilty, despite carrying none of their guilt. The prophet had put it in words centuries before anyone arranged 3 crosses on a hill. And here it was, arranged 3 of them, with the innocent one deliberately set in the middle so that his official position, in the eyes of everyone watching, was one criminal among criminals. Even the seating chart, so to speak, was in the script. And if you pull the 2 threads together, the 2 men become something more than 2 individuals. They become a picture of every possible response to this whole scene, laid out side by side in the starkest terms. 2 men in the identical situation, equally close to the man in the middle, equally out of time, equally guilty. And one turns toward him and one turns away. One mocks and one asks. One sees only another failed prisoner dying beside him, and one sees something worth being remembered by. Same distance, same evidence, same final hours, opposite conclusions. It is the entire drama of how people meet this story compressed into 2 dying men on either side of a hill. And the account seems to place them there quite deliberately as a mirror, inviting anyone looking on to notice, quietly, which of the 2 they most resemble. Even the men condemned to die alongside him turned out to be part of the pattern cast, whether they knew it or not, as the 2 answers the whole world would go on giving. And while one of those 2 men is being welcomed back into a reopened garden with a handful of words, something else is happening at the foot of that middle cross, something smaller and more intimate and easy to lose in the noise of the crowd. A little group has gathered close to the wood, the few who did not run, and among them stands a woman who has known this man since before he could speak, alongside a young follower who loved him. In the middle of an execution, with the whole weight of everything we have been describing pressing down, the man on the cross turns his attention to those 2 ordinary people standing below him and says something to them that, on the surface, sounds like a dying man simply tidying up his family affairs. It is far more than that. Because in a few short words, right there at the foot of the cross, he is about to do something that looks a lot like starting a brand new family out of the wreckage, and that is exactly where we are going next. So let us bring that little cluster of people at the base of the cross into focus, because they are worth looking at closely. When the crowds are thinning and the danger of being associated with a condemned man is at its height, the people who stay are telling you something just by staying. Most of the man's closest followers had scattered, which is the sort of thing that happens when your leader is publicly executed, and standing anywhere nearby suddenly seems like a very poor career move. But a small handful did not run. A few women who had followed him and supported him, including his own mother, and one young follower, the one the accounts describe simply as the disciple he loved, planted themselves within sight of the wood and refused to leave. In a scene defined by abandonment, they are the exception, the ones who showed up when showing up cost something. It is worth noticing who exactly made up that faithful little group, because it is not who you might expect. The bold speeches about loyalty, the promises to stand firm no matter what, had mostly come earlier from the men in the inner circle, and the men in the inner circle were, at this particular moment, conspicuously elsewhere. The people who actually stayed, who stood in plain view at the foot of a cross when doing so, marked you out as a friend of a convicted criminal, were largely the women who had followed him, several of whom the accounts take care to name individually. That detail, the naming, is quietly important because it functions like a signature on a witness statement. These were real, identifiable people, women you could have gone and spoken to afterward, and the accounts are effectively saying, here are the ones who were actually there, ask them. There is a gentle irony in it too, given how little weight the testimony of women was granted in the legal culture of the day. The most important eyewitnesses to the most important scene, the ones who stayed when everyone else scattered, were precisely the people whose word that society was least inclined to take seriously. If you were fabricating a story to impress that particular audience, these are not the witnesses you would choose, which is one more small reason the scene has the ring of something remembered rather than invented. And it is to these people in the middle of everything that the man on the cross turns his attention, which is itself a remarkable thing to register before we even get to what he says. A person in his physical state would have every excuse to be entirely absorbed in his own ordeal, and nobody would blame him for it. Instead, he looks down, finds his mother in the crowd, finds the young follower standing near her, and takes the trouble to speak to them directly. What he says is short, just a handful of words in 2 brief lines, but those words have been turned over and marveled at for 2,000 years, because they are doing something far larger than they first appear. He looks at his mother and he does not call her mother. He calls her woman, which to modern ears sounds jarringly cold, like something you would say right before an argument got serious. But in the language and customs of the time, it was not rude at all. It was a perfectly respectful form of address, gentle even, closer to lady or madam than to any insult. Still, it is a striking choice because it is not the intimate word a son would normally use, and as we will see shortly, that specific choice of word is very deliberately pointed at something much older than this one family. He says to her, in effect, "Woman, look, here is your son," gesturing toward the young follower beside her. And then he turns to that follower and says, the mirror image, "Look, here is your mother." 2 short sentences, and with them he hands these 2 people to each other. And there is a quiet bookend hidden in that word woman that most people miss entirely. Because this was not the first time he had addressed his mother that way at a significant moment. Right at the very start of his public life, at a wedding celebration where he performed his first public sign, the thing that launched everything that followed, his mother had come to him with a problem, and he had answered her gently with that same word, woman. It was the opening bracket of his public story. And now, here at the very end, in his final moments, he reaches for the identical word one last time. The word that opened the first sign closes the last act. The first time, at a feast full of joy and new wine, with everything ahead of him. The last time, on a hill, with everything behind him. Same woman, same word, the 2 ends of the whole story tied together with a single, deliberate thread. It is the sort of detail that looks like nothing until you spot it, and then looks like anything but an accident. On the most immediate level, this is simply a good and dutiful son making arrangements. In that world, the responsibility of caring for a widowed mother fell squarely on her children, and a son facing death would naturally want to know that his mother would be provided for and protected after he was gone. There were no pensions, no social safety nets, no government office you could call to arrange support for an elderly widow. Your children were your retirement plan, your care home, and your security system all rolled into one, and a woman who outlived both her husband and her providing son was in a genuinely precarious position. So on the surface, this is a man tidying up the single most important loose end of his earthly life, making sure the woman who raised him would not be left alone and unsupported, which is, on its own, quietly moving. Even in that state, his mind goes to somebody else's needs. There is a small puzzle tucked into it, though, that points toward the deeper meaning, and it is this. Why hand his mother to this young follower at all, rather than to family? By most accounts, the man had brothers, siblings who by the ordinary rules of the time would have been the obvious ones to take responsibility for their mother. Handing her instead to someone outside the blood family is a slightly unexpected move. And while there are practical explanations, the fact that he reaches past blood relatives and creates a new bond between 2 people who are not related by blood at all is exactly the point that the deeper reading fastens onto. Because he is not just solving a logistical problem, he is doing something that looks, on closer inspection, a great deal like founding a new kind of family right there at the foot of the cross. And that is meaning number 12. Watch what actually happens in those 2 sentences. A woman who is a mother, but at this moment losing her son, is given a new son. A young man standing there is given a new mother. 2 people who walked up to that hill, unrelated, walk away from it, bound together as family, and the only thing connecting them is the man on the cross between them. He is, quite literally, the link. Take him out of the middle, and there is no relationship at all, just two strangers who happen to be standing in the same place on a terrible afternoon. But with him at the center, they become mother and son. And that is the seed of an idea that would go on to define the entire movement that grew out of this. The notion that the people gathered around this man form a family that cuts straight across the ordinary lines of blood and clan and nation, where people who share no ancestry at all start calling one another brother, sister, mother, child, and actually mean it. The whole later community understood itself in exactly these terms, as a household assembled not by birth but by attachment to this one person. And here, in these two short lines, is the founding moment of that household, its first two members introduced to each other by the dying man who links them. And the young follower did not treat it as a nice sentiment to nod along to and then forget. The account adds a small, telling coda that from that very hour he took the woman into his own home, into his own care. Not from the next convenient moment, not once things had settled down, but from that hour, immediately, while the man who had asked it of him was still hanging on the cross. It was, in effect, an instant and lifelong commitment, taken on with no hesitation, and one imagines no real idea of what he was signing up for. By tradition, he went on to look after her for the rest of her life, years and years of ordinary daily care that no one recorded because it was not dramatic, just faithful. Which is its own quiet lesson about the family being founded here. It was not built out of grand declarations. It was built out of a young man quietly picking up a responsibility that was not biologically his, and simply carrying it day after day because the person in the middle had asked him to. The household born at the cross was held together from its very first hour by exactly that kind of unglamorous, unrecorded faithfulness. He had said things before that pointed this direction, that his real family was not defined by who shared his bloodline, but by who was gathered around him, a claim that must have sounded strange and even a little hurtful to relatives at the time. But claims are easy. Here, at the very end, he does it. He takes two people and with a few words makes them a family, demonstrating in the flesh the thing he had only described before. It is one thing to say that a new kind of kinship is possible. It is another to stitch the first two members of it together while you are hanging on a cross, using what little breath you have left to perform the introduction. This is not a man passively enduring his fate and waiting for it to be over. This is a man actively building something, doing deliberate, purposeful work right up until his final moments, arranging the future even as his own runs out. There is nothing vague or checked out about it. He is fully present, fully aware, and fully occupied with the needs of other people, which is a strange and striking thing to be doing under the circumstances. It is worth dwelling for a moment on just how radical this new kind of household would turn out to be, because the pattern set here at the cross scaled up into something the ancient world had genuinely never seen. A family defined not by blood but by attachment to a single person meant that the ordinary walls separating people simply stopped applying. Those of different nations, different languages, different social ranks, the free and the enslaved, the respectable and the disreputable, all ended up inside the same household, calling one another by family names they had no biological right to use, and treating those names as entirely real. In a world sorted rigidly by clan and class and birthplace, this was close to scandalous, a household that quietly ignored every boundary the surrounding society considered load-bearing. And the whole improbable structure traces back to this one small moment on the hill, two unrelated people being made mother and son by a third. The blueprint for a family that would eventually refuse to recognize any of the usual dividing lines was drawn, rather fittingly, at the single place where all human dividing lines tend to look their smallest, right at the foot of an execution. Now, back to that word, woman, because it turns out to be the thread that ties this small family scene to the largest story of all. It is such an unusual way for a son to address his mother that it invites you to ask why, and the answer that a long line of thinkers has offered reaches all the way back to the very beginning, to the first woman in the whole story. You will remember that we have already spent time on the first man, and on the way this entire hill seems designed to reverse the disaster that started with him in a garden. Well, the first man did not act alone in that opening scene. There was a first woman beside him, and after everything went wrong, she was given a title, a name that meant something like the mother of all who live, because from her the entire human family would descend. She was, in the most literal sense the story allows, everybody's mother, the source of the whole line. And here's where the deliberate echo comes in, and it needs a very clear label on it, because this is a matter of interpretation rather than something spelled out plainly in the text, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. A rich tradition of later reflection reads this moment at the cross as a bookend to that opening scene, casting the mother standing at the foot of the wood as a kind of second version of that first woman, a new mother of all who live. The logic runs like this. The first woman was present at the moment the old humanity began, and, in the story, at the moment it fell. And here is a woman, addressed pointedly not as mother but by that same title. Woman, present at the moment a new humanity is being born out of the wreckage on this hill. Where the first woman was mother to a race marked by the fall, this one is being positioned in this reading as mother to the new family being founded at the cross, the household we just watched come into being. It is a beautiful and deliberate piece of symmetry, the story once again folding back to answer its own opening. But, and this matters, it is a theological reading layered onto the scene by later interpreters, drawing out a resonance, not a caption printed in the original account. The text gives us the striking word and the striking placement. What that word is meant to evoke is the part careful readers have argued over ever since. And honesty requires keeping the two things distinct rather than smuggling the interpretation in as if it were plain fact. Either way, whether you take the deeper echo or stay strictly on the surface, the shape of the scene is the same and it is genuinely astonishing. At a site defined entirely by death, where the whole business of the day is ending a life as publicly and finally as possible, something is quietly being born, a new family, a new kind of belonging. The first two members of a household that would eventually span the globe, introduced to one another in the middle of an execution by the man whose death is the very thing making it possible. People came to this hill to watch someone die, and while that was certainly happening, so was something nobody in the crowd had the eyes to see. At the foot of the cross, right there in the shadow of the worst that human beings can do to one another, a family was being started, which is not the sort of thing you expect to find at an execution, and is precisely the sort of surprise this whole scene keeps springing on anyone paying close enough attention. That brings us to something that requires stepping back from the hill entirely, because we have been reading this whole scene through the eyes of the people who watched it, the followers, the soldiers, the passers-by, the witnesses, looking up at the cross from below. But there exists another account of this exact event, one written from a completely different vantage point, and it is one of the strangest and most powerful things in the entire collection, because this account does not describe the crucifixion from the outside, from the perspective of the crowd. It describes it apparently from the inside, in the first person, as if narrated by the man on the cross himself. And the truly staggering part is when it was written, because it was composed roughly 1,000 years before the events on that hill, by a man who could not possibly have witnessed any of it. The man was David, the shepherd who became a king, a poet and songwriter who lived and died 10 centuries before that particular afternoon. Among the many songs and poems attributed to him is one that, on the surface, reads as a personal cry of anguish, the lament of a suffering man pouring out his distress. That was presumably how it was understood for the 1,000 years between its writing and this day on the hill. Just a very moving, very raw poem about pain. But if you lay that ancient poem side by side with what happens at this crucifixion, line by line, the hair on the back of your neck starts to stand up, because it stops reading like a general lament and starts reading like an eyewitness transcript of a specific event that would not occur for another millennium. And we are not guessing that the connection is deliberate, because the man on the cross himself points us straight to this poem. Near the end, out of the darkness and the exhaustion, he cries out a single line at the top of what voice he has left. My God, why have you abandoned me?" It is one of the most wrenching sentences in the whole account, a raw shout of desolation. And it is not original to him, it is, word for word, the opening line of that ancient poem of David. He is quoting it. Which is doing something very specific, because in the world of that time, calling out the first line of a well-known text was a recognized way of invoking the entire thing. The way you might say the opening words of a famous song and expect everyone to hear the whole tune in their head. By crying out that first line, he is not just expressing his own agony, though he certainly is doing that. He is, in effect, pointing a finger at the whole poem and saying, "This, all of this, look at what is written here." He is handing the crowd and everyone who would ever read the account afterward a reference. Go and read the rest. There is a genuine and very old question about that cry, one worth pausing on, because it cuts to the heart of what the whole moment meant. Was it a shout of real, bottomless despair, a man at the absolute end of himself feeling utterly cut off from everything? Or was it, given what we just said about invoking an entire text by its opening line, something more deliberate, a man pointing knowingly at a poem he understood completely, including its triumphant ending? And the honest answer, the one that does the scene justice, is almost certainly both at once. There's no reason the anguish cannot be entirely real and the reference entirely intentional at the same time. He could mean every agonized syllable of that opening line, feeling the abandonment in his body with full force, and also be reaching, even in that state, for the one text that maps his suffering exactly and then carries it all the way through to victory. That is arguably the more staggering reading. Not a man who is either purely despairing or coolly performing, but a man drowning in genuine desolation who still has the presence of mind, or perhaps the deep instinct, to grab hold of the very words that both describe the darkness and promise the dawn. He is not choosing between the pain and the hope. He is holding both in the same breath, in the same borrowed line. So let us do exactly that and go and read the rest, because the rest is where it gets genuinely uncanny. A little way into the poem, the suffering figure describes his tormentors surrounding him, and then delivers a line that should stop you cold. He says that they have pierced his hands and his feet. Now sit with the problem that creates. The poem was written 1,000 years early in a culture whose own method of capital punishment was nothing remotely like this. Execution in David's world did not involve piercing a person's hands and feet and fixing them to anything. That specific, gruesome method belonged to other empires and would only arrive on that hill through the machinery of a foreign occupying power many centuries after David was long dead. So how does a poet, writing in an era and a culture that did not practice this at all, land on the one detail, pierced hands and feet, that precisely describes a form of death he had no reason to have ever imagined? It is a bit like finding a detailed description of a modern piece of technology sketched into a diary from the deep past, an anachronism so specific it is hard to shrug off. And to feel the full weight of the anachronism, you have to understand just how foreign this method of killing was to David's own world. When David's people carried out a death sentence, their method was not this at all. It was something else entirely, a different procedure with nothing in common with pinning a living person to a wooden frame by driving points through the hands and feet. That particular horror was a specialty developed elsewhere, refined by a series of foreign empires as an instrument of terror and domination, and it only arrived on that hill because a later occupying power had adopted and perfected it as its preferred way of making a public example of troublemakers. In David's day, it simply was not part of the toolkit. So this is not a poet describing a familiar local practice and getting lucky. It is a poet describing, in accurate detail, a method of execution that his own culture did not use, that would be imported from abroad and applied on that specific hill only after 1,000 years had passed. He had no template for it, no local example to draw on, nothing in his own experience that would have put that precise image in his head. And yet there it sits, in the middle of the poem, waiting 1,000 years for reality to catch up to it. And before anyone objects, it is worth being straight about the fact that scholars have argued over the exact wording of that particular line for a very long time, because different ancient copies of the text word it slightly differently, and that is a real and honest debate. But here is the detail that tends to settle the matter for a lot of people. Long before the events on the hill, well over a century before, this collection of poems was translated out of the original language into the common international tongue we mentioned earlier, so that a wider world could read it. And that ancient translation, produced by people who had absolutely no knowledge of and no stake in a future execution, renders the line unambiguously, "They dug through, they pierced." The translators wrote pierced hands and feet into their version generations before the man on the cross was even born. Whatever the arguments about the very oldest wording, the reading was sitting there in black and white, in a widely used version of the text, long in advance. Nobody edited it in afterward to make it fit. It was already there, waiting. That is meaning number 13, and the piercing is only the beginning of the matches. Keep reading the poem, and the specifics keep landing. The suffering figure describes the crowd around him staring and gloating. He describes people mocking him, and he even records the exact content of their taunt. They jeer in the poem that he trusted in God, so let God rescue him now if God is so fond of him. And when you turn back to the account of the actual crucifixion, there are the religious leaders standing beneath the cross, throwing out a taunt that is almost a direct quotation of that ancient line. He trusted in God, they sneer, let God deliver him now if God wants him. They are, without any apparent awareness of it, reciting the script. A poem written 10 centuries earlier had put words in the mouths of mockers, and here are mockers on cue saying them. If someone had handed those priests the ancient poem and asked them to perform the villain's part, they could not have delivered the lines more faithfully. Naturally, not one of them seems to notice they are quoting scripture at the very man the scripture is about. The poem is just as precise about the setting around the sufferer, not only the words of the mockers, but the whole atmosphere of encirclement. It describes a ring of hostile figures closing in on every side, a crowd pressing around and staring, faces gaping at him, a circle of onlookers who have come not to help, but to watch and to gloat. It describes being surrounded, hemmed in, made into a public spectacle for a jeering audience. And that is, with unsettling accuracy, exactly the scene at the foot of the cross. A raised and exposed spot on a busy road, as we saw earlier, deliberately positioned so that the maximum number of people could gather and gawk. The poem does not just predict the physical torment and the specific insults. It predicts the shape of the crowd, the sensation of being ringed by staring faces with nowhere to hide, the particular loneliness of suffering in front of an audience that has turned up to enjoy it. Every layer of the experience, the wounds, the words, the watching mob, was sketched out in advance in the same ancient poem. The poem goes further still into the raw, physical experience of what is happening, and it reads like a clinical description of a body giving out under exactly this kind of ordeal. The figure in the poem says his strength has drained away like water, that his bones feel pulled out of joint, that his heart has turned to wax and melted inside him, that his mouth is dried up and his tongue sticks to his jaws, that he is being poured out and emptied. These are not vague poetic gestures at feeling sad. They are eerily precise descriptions of the specific physical process of dying in this specific way, the dehydration, the strain on the joints and the frame, the failing strength, all of it set down by a poet 1,000 years before anyone on that hill lifted a hammer. It is the difference between a general poem about sorrow and something that reads like a medical account filed in advance. We have, in fact, already run into one of the lines from this very poem without dwelling on where it came from. Back when the soldiers were dividing up the clothing and gambling for the one piece they would not tear, that whole two-part action, the dividing and then the casting of lots for the garment, was lifted straight out of this poem, which describes precisely that. Enemies parceling out the sufferer's clothes and throwing lots over his clothing. We flagged it at the time and promised to come back to the source, and here it is, so there is no need to walk through it again. Just notice that yet another oddly specific detail, the exact behavior of bored soldiers at the foot of a cross, was sitting in this 1,000-year-old poem all along. One more line in a document that keeps reading like a transcript. And now for the turn, which is the part almost nobody expects, because if all you knew of this poem was the opening cry of abandonment, you would assume it was relentlessly bleak from start to finish. A pure howl of despair with no way out. It is not. Something remarkable happens as the poem goes on. The tone shifts. The desolation, without being denied or minimized, begins to give way. And the second half of the poem climbs out of the pit into something that can only be called triumph. The suffering figure starts speaking not of defeat, but of a stunning, sweeping victory that will follow. He declares that the whole earth, every distant corner of it, all the ends of the world, will remember and turn back toward God. He speaks of families and nations, people who had nothing to do with any of this, bowing and worshiping. He speaks of generations not yet born being told about what was done, of a people who did not even exist yet coming to hear the news. The poem that opens with a man crying out that he has been abandoned, closes with the entire planet turning toward the very God he cried out to. and it ends on a note that essentially declares the thing accomplished, finished, done. And there is a line in that triumphant second half that is worth holding up to the light because it points across 3,000 years directly at whoever happens to be reading or hearing this right now. The poem promises that the story of what was done will be carried forward to generations not yet born, that a people who did not yet exist would be told about it, that those coming long afterward would hear the account and be counted in. Think about what that actually means from where the poet was standing. He was describing an audience that lay not just past his own lifetime, but past the events themselves, a future crowd stretching out beyond the horizon. People who would come to know this story long after everyone who witnessed it firsthand was gone. And here is the quietly staggering part. If you are following any of this at all, you are one of them. You are, quite literally, the future generation the poem reached forward to name, the people not yet created who would nonetheless be told. A song written 3,000 years ago closes by pointing down the centuries at an audience it could not see, and the audience it was pointing at includes you, which is either a remarkable coincidence or a genuinely unnerving piece of long-range aim, and the poem itself seems to have no doubt about which. Sit with what that means, because it is extraordinary, woven into the very same text that so precisely predicts the suffering right there in its closing lines, is the outcome, the victory, the global turnaround that the suffering was supposed to produce. The despair and the triumph are in the same poem, the agony in the first half and the worldwide happy ending in the second, as though from the very beginning the pain was never the destination but the doorway. The cry of abandonment and the vision of the whole earth turning to God are not two different poems. They are one, and the poem clearly wants you to read them together, to understand that the darkness at the start was always leading somewhere. And this connects to a single, quietly devastating line written much later in one of the letters that pulls the whole thing together. It says that this man endured the cross and everything that came with it for the sake of a joy that had been set out in front of him, a joy waiting on the far side of the suffering that made the suffering bearable, even purposeful. He was, in other words, looking past the agony toward something he wanted badly enough to go through all of it to reach. And when you ask what that joy actually was, what was worth enduring all of this for, the answer the whole story keeps circling back toward is almost uncomfortable in its intimacy. The joy set in front of him, the thing on the far side of the suffering that he had his eyes fixed on the entire time, was people. Was the whole family being founded at the foot of the cross? Was every one of those distant nations in the poem turning back toward home? Was, if the story is to be believed, us. He went through the whole thing with the ending already in view, the triumphant second half of that ancient poem playing in his mind, even as he lived out its agonizing first half, because he could see, past all of it, exactly what it was for. For all that inner drama unfolding in the ancient poem, though, the people actually standing on that hill were not reading a 1,000-year-old song. They were looking up because the sky above them had started doing something deeply, unmistakably wrong. Right around the middle of the day, at the point when the sun should have been directly overhead and the light at its absolute strongest, the light began to fail. Not the soft dimming of evening, not a passing cloud, but a genuine darkness settling over everything in the middle of the day, and it held for hours, roughly from noon until the middle of the afternoon. 3 hours of darkness at the one time of day when darkness has no business existing. If you have ever been outside when the sky goes strange and green before a violent storm, you have a faint taste of how disorienting it is when the light does something it is not supposed to do, except this was not a storm rolling in. This was the sun itself at its high point, simply going out. Now, the first thing a modern mind reaches for is a tidy, natural explanation, and the obvious candidate is a solar eclipse. The moon slides in front of the sun, the sky darkens, everyone panics, perfectly explicable. Except that explanation runs straight into a wall, and the wall is astronomy. This whole event took place during a particular festival, and that festival was timed, by its very design, to the full moon. It always fell at the point in the lunar cycle when the moon is on the exact opposite side of the earth from the sun, fully lit, hanging in the night sky like a great bright coin. And a solar eclipse, the kind where the moon blots out the sun, is physically only possible at the opposite point in the cycle, when the moon passes directly between the earth and the sun, which is to say at the new moon, when the moon is dark and invisible. So of all the days in the entire year on which you might try to explain away a midday darkness as an eclipse, this was quite possibly the single worst one to pick, because it was the one time of the month when a solar eclipse is flatly, physically impossible. The moon was in completely the wrong place. Whatever put out the light that afternoon, it was not the tidy mechanics of the solar system, which leaves us with the far more unsettling option that the darkness was not an accident of physics at all, but a sign, a deliberate statement written across the sky. And in keeping with just about everything else on this hill, it was a sign that had been called in advance. Centuries earlier, one of the old prophets had delivered a warning that included a very specific and very strange image. He described a coming day when God would make the sun go down at noon and bring darkness over the land in the middle of a bright day. Not sunset in the evening, where it belongs, but the sun failing at high noon and the earth plunged into gloom while it should still have been broad daylight. That is a remarkably precise thing to predict, because midday darkness is not a normal feature of anyone's doom prophecy. And yet there it was, written down long before, and here it was, happening at the exact time of day the prophet had named. And there is a second, older echo layered underneath that one, going back to the founding story of the whole nation. Long before, when the people were still enslaved in a foreign land, a series of devastating plagues had fallen on their oppressors, each one a blow of judgment, building toward their release. And one of the last and most dreadful of those plagues, right before the great night of deliverance that the whole festival now commemorated, was a thick, oppressive darkness that fell over the land, a darkness so heavy it was described as something you could almost feel, blotting out the light for days. Darkness as a plague, darkness as judgment, darkness as the thing that comes immediately before a rescue. And here, on this hill, on the anniversary of exactly that ancient rescue, the darkness falls again. This is meaning number 14, and the threads keep braiding together in the same place, judgment and darkness, and that founding night of deliverance all converging at the same spot on the same afternoon in the failing light. We are deliberately not unpacking the full weight of that founding night just yet, because it has its own chapter coming, but you can already feel it pressing in at the edges. The sky goes dark, exactly as a plague of judgment once went dark, on the very anniversary of the night that judgment passed a people over. And then, while the sky is still black over the hill, at that same terrible moment, something happens some distance away, out of sight of the crowd on the hill, in the most sacred building in the entire nation. To understand why it matters, you have to know a little about how that building was arranged, because the architecture was itself a sermon. At the very heart of it, deep inside, was a single room considered the most holy space in the world, the place where the presence of God was understood to dwell in a unique and concentrated way. And this room was not open to the public. It was not open to the priests. It was, in fact, off limits to essentially everyone, all year round, every year, with exactly one exception. Once a year, on the single most solemn day of the calendar, one man and one man only, the high priest, was permitted to pass inside, and even then only with elaborate preparation and considerable personal risk. For everyone else, at every other time, the message was absolute. You do not come in here. The way is closed. And separating that most sacred inner room from the rest of the building was a barrier, a vast, heavy curtain, an enormous woven veil hung across the entrance. This was no flimsy drape. By long tradition, it was immense, tall as the room itself, and remarkably thick and heavy. A serious, substantial piece of fabric that functioned as a wall you could not see through. Its entire purpose was separation. It stood as the physical embodiment of the whole arrangement, the great barrier that said, on one side, ordinary people and ordinary space, on the other side, the presence of God, and never the two shall casually meet. That curtain was the closed door of the entire system, the visible sign that access was restricted, that a gap stood between people and God that could not simply be strolled across. And at the moment the man on the hill breathed his last, that curtain tore, straight down the middle, splitting into two. And here is the detail that carries the whole meaning. It tore from the top to the bottom. This is meaning number 15, and it is enormous. Think first about what the tearing itself signifies. The great barrier that had kept everyone out of the presence of God, the curtain that embodied the closed door, is ripped wide open at the precise instant of this death. The message could hardly be more direct. The way in, sealed for so long, is now open. The restriction is lifted. The gap that could not be crossed has just been torn straight through. Whatever this death accomplished, one of its immediate effects, announced by the shredding of that curtain, is that the door to God is no longer shut. And then there is the direction of the tear, which is the detail people rush past and absolutely should not, because it is doing something profound. It tore from the top down. Now picture the practical problem of tearing an enormous, heavy curtain that stands taller than a person. If a human being wanted to rip it, they would have to start at the bottom, at the level they could actually reach, and tear upward, straining against the weight of the fabric. Starting at the very top, well above where any person could reach, and tearing downward, is not something a human could easily do. It is the kind of tear that comes from above, from a hand higher than any human hand. And that is precisely the point the detail is quietly making. This barrier was not torn open by a person deciding to break the rules and force their way in. It was torn open from above, from the top down, which is a way of saying, without saying it outright, that the one who opened the door was God. It was not humanity breaking in, it was God opening up. The way was not seized from below, it was thrown open from above. And the later reflection on all this draws the line explicitly, treating this very moment as the opening of a new and living way into the presence of God, a way that runs directly through the body of the man on the cross, his own life becoming the doorway where the curtain used to be. So hold the two signs together, because they are happening at the same time and they are saying two halves of one thing. Outside, over the hill and the land, the sky goes black in the middle of the day, an ancient image of judgment falling, the light going out on an old order that is coming to its end. And inside, in the heart of the most sacred building in the nation, the great curtain is torn open from the top by an unseen hand. The closed door of the old arrangement flung wide, the way to God opened for everyone, no longer the exclusive annual privilege of a single man. Judgment on one side, open access on the other, a verdict and an invitation delivered in the same moment. The death on that hill is, in a single stroke, both the end of one thing and the beginning of another. The darkness closing a door on the old, and the torn curtain opening a door to the new, which is a lot to be happening in the sky and the sanctuary at once, and not a single bit of it made the evening's official report, because the men keeping the records were busy elsewhere. And in the middle of all of that, the darkness overhead and the curtain tearing out of sight, the man on the cross speaks one final time, and what he says is the shortest, and once you understand it, quite possibly the most important thing said all day. In the original language, it was a single word, just one. He said, in effect, it is finished. One word, and then he was gone. And most people hear that and assume it is the exhausted whisper of a man at the very end of his endurance, a sort of resigned it is over, the last flicker of someone who has simply run out of road, a groan of defeat. But that reading gets the word almost exactly backward, because the single word he chose was not a word of surrender at all. It was, of all things, a commercial term, a word from the world of business and debt and accounts, and knowing that changes everything about how the whole scene lands. Here is where a rather unglamorous branch of scholarship comes to the rescue, the study of ancient, everyday documents, the receipts and bills and scraps of paperwork that ordinary people left behind. When researchers dug through mountains of these old financial records, they kept finding this exact word stamped and scrawled across certain documents, and the documents in question were bills of debt. The word was what you wrote across an account when it had been settled in full. It meant paid in full, discharged. The debt is closed, the balance is zero, there is nothing further owing. It was the ancient equivalent of the big red stamp that says paid slammed across an invoice, or the satisfying moment when a loan account finally clicks over to a balance of nothing. That is the word he chose for his final breath. Not, it is over in the sense of defeat, but it is complete in the sense of a debt fully discharged, an account closed out, a bill paid down to the last coin with nothing left to pay. This is meaning number 16, and it turns the last word on the cross from a whimper into a declaration. Think about what he is actually announcing. If the whole ordeal was, in the logic of the story, about settling an account that humanity could never settle for itself, a debt piled up beyond any hope of repayment, then this single word is the receipt being stamped. It is not the sound of a man losing. It is the sound of a transaction being completed, the final entry written in the ledger, the account marked closed, paid in full. Nothing more required, nothing left outstanding, no balance remaining for anyone to clear. And the grammar of the word in the original reinforces it beautifully, because it carries the sense of something that was completed in the past and stays completed permanently, a done deal that remains done. Not it is being paid, not it will be paid, but it stands finished once and for all. The last thing he says is essentially the click of an account settling to zero and staying there. And as if one seal on the moment were not enough, there is a second one hidden in the clock in the specific time of day that all of this happened. He died in the middle of the afternoon at what that culture reckoned as the 9th hour, roughly 3 in the afternoon by our counting. Now, on its own, that is just a time. But in the sacred rhythm of that nation, that particular hour was not just any hour. It was one of the fixed, appointed times of daily worship, and specifically it was the hour of the evening offering, the moment each day when, in the great temple, a lamb was prepared and offered as the daily sacrifice on behalf of the whole people. Every single day, as the afternoon wore on toward that hour, the priests went about the ancient routine of the evening sacrifice, a rhythm so regular and so central that people arranged their prayers around it, gathering to pray at exactly that hour. It was the daily heartbeat of the nation's worship, as fixed and familiar as a bell that rings at the same time every afternoon. And that is meaning number 17, and the synchronization is almost too precise to bear. At the very hour, on the very afternoon, when the priests in the temple were going through the ancient motions of the evening sacrifice, preparing and offering the daily lamb exactly as they had every day for centuries, the man on the hill outside the city breathed his last. 2 things happening at the same moment in 2 places, and the whole account clearly wants you to see them as one event with 2 faces. In the temple, the routine sacrifice, the lamb offered as it always was, at the time it always was. On the hill, the death that all those centuries of routine sacrifices had, in the logic of the story, only ever been pointing toward. The clocks match. As the official lamb was being offered inside, the true one, the reality behind all the routine, was dying outside at the identical hour. We are deliberately holding back the full weight of that lamb imagery, because it has its own chapter coming right up. But even without unpacking it, the timing lands like a hammer. He did not die at a random moment. He died on the exact hour the nation had been rehearsing, every single afternoon, for as long as anyone could remember. Put the 2 seals together, the word paid in full and the hour of the appointed sacrifice, and you get the distinct impression that even the specific minute of this death was not left to chance. It was scheduled. It landed precisely on the beat the whole system had been keeping all along. Now, most tellings of this scene would slow down and dwell on the death itself, and then move gently toward the aftermath. But there is an episode that gets reported in the very same breath as the darkness and the torn curtain, an episode so strange and so dramatic that a great many retellings quietly skip right over it, apparently deciding it is a bit much. And that is a genuine shame, because it may be the most overlooked few sentences in the entire account. According to the record, at the moment of the death, alongside the darkness and the tearing of the curtain, the ground itself convulsed. There was an earthquake. The earth shook and rocks split apart, cracking open under the strain. And then, in a detail that reads more like the climax of some epic than a sober historical note, tombs broke open, and a number of people who had died were seen alive again, raised up, and later went into the city where they were recognized. Now you can see why the timid retellings tiptoe past this one. It is a lot, but skipping it means missing 2 of the biggest ideas on the whole hill. Take the earthquake first. This is meaning number 18, and it is about scale. When this man dies, the planet reacts. The solid ground, the most stable and dependable thing we know, the very definition of something that does not move, buckles and shakes, and the rocks, the bones of the earth, crack open under the pressure. Whatever else you make of it, the image is unmistakable. This is not a private, local, minor event, one more execution among the thousands that empire carried out. This is being presented as an event of such magnitude that the physical creation itself feels it and convulses in response. The earth cannot stay still through this. The ground splits. Creation shudders. It is the universe registering, in the only language a planet has, that something of staggering importance has just occurred, something that reaches all the way down into the foundations of the world. The death that the crowd saw as the pathetic end of a failed troublemaker is, in this telling, a shockwave that runs through the very structure of reality. And then, out of those cracked open tombs, the truly astonishing part. This is meaning number 19, and it turns the whole scene inside out. People who were dead came back. The graves opened and gave up some of the dead, who were seen walking, alive, recognized by those who had known them. Now hold this next to what the whole story has been building toward, because it is not a random horror show, it is a preview. Running all through the older writings is a long-held hope, a promise that death would not have the final word, that one day the dead would rise, that graves would open, and those sleeping in the dust of the earth would wake and live again. It was one of the great future hopes, the promise that at the end of all things, life would win, and the dead would stand up. And here, at the very instant of this death, that future hope flickers on early, like a trailer for a film not yet released. The tombs open, the dead walk. The thing promised for the distant end shows up in a small first installment, right at the moment this man dies, as if his death had reached into the grave and started prying it open ahead of schedule. And there is a careful little detail in the sequence that is easy to miss but matters enormously. The account is specific that these raised people went into the city only after this man himself had risen. In other words, the order is preserved. He goes first. He is, as the later writings put it, the first of the harvest, the very first to come through death and out the other side, into a life that death cannot touch again. And only then, following behind him, do these others appear in the city as a kind of first handful of what is to come. It is not a chaotic free for all of the dead wandering about. It is an ordered thing with a clear first, and he is it, which reframes the entire cross yet again. We tend to file the whole scene under death, the end, the tragic conclusion. But the earthquake and the open tombs are quietly insisting on the opposite. Even here, even at the moment that looks like the ultimate victory of death, death is already losing its grip. The graves are already cracking. The cross is not just the story of a death. It is, apparently, the moment the reversal of all death begins, the first tremor of the graves starting to give up what they hold. And this brings us to a cluster of details right around the death that, taken together, function as a kind of official seal, a signature confirming exactly what has been going on beneath the surface this entire time. We have been circling something for chapter after chapter, hinting at it, hearing it press in at the edges, that founding night of national deliverance. And now it is time to bring it fully into the light, because three separate things happen at the cross that, when you line them up, point unmistakably at that ancient night, and the Lamb at the center of it. The first has to do with the way the executions were being wrapped up. In the interest of not leaving the condemned lingering, there was a brutal but standard procedure for hastening death, and the soldiers moved to carry it out on the two men crucified alongside. That procedure involved breaking the legs of the dying, which we will leave described no more graphically than that, and they did it to the two. But when they came to the man in the middle, they found he was already dead, and so they did not carry out the procedure on him. His legs were left unbroken, his bones were left intact, and that, which looks like a small procedural footnote, an executioner skipping a step because it was no longer necessary, is meaning number 20. And it is a bullseye hit on something written into the law of that founding night more than 1,000 years earlier. Because the ancient regulations governing the special lamb of that founding festival contained a very particular and rather odd little rule. The lamb, when it was prepared, was to be treated with a specific restriction. Not one of its bones was to be broken. Whatever else you did not break the bones of that lamb. It is a strangely specific requirement. The sort of rule that would have seemed almost arbitrary for centuries, a minor ceremonial detail among many. Keep the bones intact. And there is an echo of the same promise in one of the old songs, where it is said of a certain righteous sufferer that he is protected in such a way that not one of his bones will be broken. For 1,000 years, that little rule about unbroken bones sat there, quietly waiting, its point not obvious. And then, on this hill, a squad of soldiers, going about their grim routine with no thought of ancient ceremonial law whatsoever, happened to leave this particular man's bones entirely unbroken, purely because he was already beyond the need for their procedure. The lamb of that founding night could have no broken bones. This man's bones were not broken. The rule, dormant for a millennium, is fulfilled to the letter by soldiers who had never heard of it. The second detail follows immediately because although they did not break his legs, one of the soldiers, apparently to confirm that he was truly dead, thrust a spear into his side. And the account notes something specific about what came out. Two things flowed from the wound, described as blood and water coming out together. Now, on the plainest level, this is presented as confirmation of genuine death, a physical sign that the man was, without any doubt, actually and fully dead, not merely unconscious or faint. There is a real, sober medical dimension to it, the body's own testimony that life had truly gone. This is meaning number 21, and it matters first simply as proof. Whatever happened afterward, it did not happen to a man who was only mostly dead. The spear and what flowed from it put the reality of the death beyond dispute. But there is a second layer to the blood and the water, because the two together carry a weight of meaning that runs all through the story. Blood, throughout the whole account, has stood for the price paid, the life given, the cost of rescue. And water, again and again, has stood for cleansing, for washing clean, for new life and fresh beginnings. And here, at the very end, from the wound in his side, the two of them flow out together, side by side, redemption and cleansing pouring from the same source in the same moment. It is the sort of image that later reflection could hardly leave alone, and it did not, seeing in that double stream from the pierced side something like the very fountainhead of everything that would follow, the price and the cleansing flowing out together from the one place, at the one time. Two streams from one wound, saying in liquid what the whole story had been saying in words. And the third detail is the simplest of all, so simple it is almost invisible, and it completes the seal. There was blood on the wood. The blood of the man ran down onto the beams of the cross, staining the timber. And to see why that matters, you have to picture the scene at the heart of that founding night one more time. On that night, long ago, a people facing a coming judgment were given a strange instruction. Take the blood of the lamb, they were told, and mark the wooden frames of your doorways with it, smear it on the wood around your doors. And do this because when the judgment sweeps through, it will see the blood on the wooden frame, and it will pass over that house, leaving everyone inside untouched. The blood on the wood was the sign that turned the judgment aside. Death came through, saw the mark on the doorframe, and passed the house by. This is meaning number 22, and once you have that picture, the cross rearranges itself in front of your eyes. Because what is the cross in this light but another wooden frame marked with the blood of the Lamb? The blood of the true Lamb running down the wooden beams, exactly as the blood of that first lamb once ran down the wooden doorposts. And the promise attached is the same. Whoever is sheltered behind that blood on the wood has the judgment pass them over, sweep on by, leave them untouched. The doorframe of that ancient night and the beams of this cross are, in this reading, the very same thing, the same blood on the same wood turning aside the same judgment. So line the three up because together they are decisive. Bones left unbroken, exactly as the lamb of that founding night was required to be. Blood and water flowing from the pierced side, the price and the cleansing together. And blood on the wood, marking the frame just as the doorposts were marked on the night the judgment passed over. Three separate, independent details, none of them arranged by anyone with the ancient law in mind, a squad of bored soldiers and the physics of a dying body, and all three of them landing precisely on the pattern of that founding lamb. It is the final seal stamped on the moment. This was the true Passover. Not a metaphor loosely applied afterward, but the real thing that every one of those ancient observances had only ever been a rehearsal for, fulfilled right down to the smallest ceremonial rule about a lamb's bones. The lamb the whole nation had been eating year after year for over 1,000 years turns out to have been a very long, very patient preview of this, which brings us at last to the thread that ties every single one of these pieces into one, the idea running underneath the whole story from its very first pages to this hill. And it is this: when it comes to the sacrifice that actually deals with what has gone wrong, the one who provides it is always God. Not people scrambling to offer God something to make up for their failures, but God again and again stepping in to provide the offering himself. And once you see that pattern, you see it everywhere, right from the beginning. Go back to the very first story, to the first man and woman and the moment everything went wrong in the garden. In the immediate aftermath, ashamed and exposed, they try to cover themselves with what they can find, stitching together a covering out of leaves, a flimsy, do-it-yourself attempt to fix their own problem. And it is worth noticing how that turns out, because their homemade solution is quietly set aside. Instead, according to the story, God himself provides them a covering, and it comes at a cost, because to make it an animal has to die. God clothes them in that covering. And there, in the opening pages, is the pattern in miniature, the very first death in the story, the very first covering for human failure. And it is not something the humans managed to produce for themselves. It is provided for them at a price by God. Their leaves were not enough. What God gave them was. From the very start, the covering for what went wrong is something God supplies, not something people manufacture. Then travel forward to a scene we touched on long ago and deliberately left unfinished, on purpose, so we could finish it here. Remember the father and son climbing the mountain, the son carrying the wood for his own offering, and remember the innocent, devastating question the son asked on the way up, the question we said we would come back to. He asked his father where the lamb for the offering actually was, since they had the wood and the fire, but no animal. And his father gave an answer that has echoed ever since. He said that God himself would provide the lamb. God will see to it. And then, at the last possible instant, with the knife raised and the whole thing about to become unbearable, that is exactly what happens. The son is spared, and a ram is found, caught by its horns in a nearby thicket, provided at the crucial moment and offered in the son's place. This is the ram we deliberately held back all that time ago, and here it finally is. The son does not die. A substitute provided by God dies instead. And the father names the place with a phrase that means, essentially, the Lord will provide. A phrase that became a kind of permanent motto for the whole idea. Where is the lamb? The son had asked. And the answer, across the whole sweep of the story, turns out to be, God will provide it himself. This is meaning number 23, and it is the spine that everything else hangs on. Draw the line from that garden to that mountain, all the way to this hill, and it is one single, unbroken line. A human problem too big for humans to fix, a price that people cannot pay themselves, and every time, God stepping in to provide what is needed at his own cost. The leaves were not enough, so God provided the covering. The son was as good as dead, so God provided the ram. And now, on this hill, with a debt no one could clear, and a rescue no one could manage, God provides once more, and this time what he provides is not an animal caught in a thicket, but his own. The pattern that began with a covering in the garden reaches its absolute limit here, where the one providing the sacrifice and the sacrifice being provided turn out, staggeringly, to be one and the same. Where is the lamb, humanity had been asking in one form or another since the garden? Here, says the whole story, pointing at the hill. Here is the lamb. God provided it himself, right down to the end. There is one more layer to the finale, and it addresses the sheer horror of the method, the fact that this death happened on a wooden cross hanging from a tree. Because the old law contained a stark and troubling statement about anyone put to death by being hung on a tree. It declared that such a person was under a curse, that hanging on a tree was itself a sign of being cursed, set outside, rejected. It is a hard, forbidding line, and for a long time it must have seemed like the last thing you would ever want, associated with a figure of hope. And yet the later reflection seizes on it deliberately and turns it completely around. It argues that this is precisely the point, that by dying in exactly this way, on a tree, this man deliberately stepped into the place of the curse, took the whole weight of that rejection onto himself, absorbed it so that it would not fall on everyone else. This is meaning number 24. He does not avoid the cursed tree. He climbs onto it on purpose, taking up the curse the way you might throw yourself on something dangerous to shield the people behind you. The tree that first brought ruin all the way back in the garden and the tree of this cross become the two ends of one story again. The curse that entered the world by a tree being drawn out of the world by a tree, soaked up and carried off by the one who let himself be hung on it. He becomes the cursed thing so that the curse itself is used up on him and has nothing left to spend on anyone else. And the story closes, fittingly, not with a demand, but with an image of almost embarrassing simplicity, drawn from yet another old episode in the wilderness. Long ago, the account goes, a people wandering in the desert came under a plague of venomous snakes and were dying from the bites, and there seemed to be no way to stop it. And the remedy they were given was strange to the point of being almost too easy. A bronze image of a serpent was made and lifted up high on a pole, raised where everyone could see it, and the instruction was simply this. Anyone who had been bitten, anyone dying of the venom, had only to look at the lifted-up serpent, and they would live. That was the whole cure. Not a ritual to perform, not a fee to pay, not a mountain to climb. Just look, turn your head, fix your eyes on the thing lifted up, and live. And the sick and dying who looked were healed, and the ones who did not were not. It was, deliberately, the simplest possible act, a cure available to anyone with the strength to turn their eyes. And the man on the cross had, earlier in his life, pointed directly at that old wilderness episode and said, plainly, that just as the serpent was lifted up on the pole in the desert, so he too would be lifted up, so that anyone who looked to him in trust would have life. This is meaning number 25, the last one, and it is the whole thing distilled down to a single, almost impossibly simple act. Salvation, in the end, is presented not as a towering achievement to be earned through a lifetime of flawless effort, but as something closer to a look, a turning of the eyes in trust toward the one lifted up on the wood. We saw it already, quietly, in the dying criminal who did nothing more than turn his head and ask, and was told he would be in paradise that very day. He did not have time to do anything else. He only had time to look. And that, the story insists, was enough, because it was always going to be enough, because the whole thing was arranged from the start to be received by a look of trust, rather than won by a lifetime of striving. Look and live. That is where all of it lands. So that is the picture, all 25 pieces of it, laid out and locked together. A cup agreed to in the dark, a guilty man walking free while an innocent one takes his place. Wood carried up a hill by a sun, twice 1,000 years apart, a skull in the ground and a new humanity begun above it. A seamless robe and a 3-language sign and dice in the dirt, every one of them saying more than the people involved could see. A refused painkiller and a loaded little plant. A criminal promised a garden, a new family stitched together with a few words. A 1,000-year-old poem read like a transcript. A darkened sky and a curtain torn from the top. A final word that meant paid in full, spoken at the exact hour of the appointed sacrifice. An earthquake and open graves, unbroken bones and blood on the wood. And underneath every last piece, the same quiet insistence that from the garden to this hill, the one providing the rescue was always God, right up to the moment he provided his own. None of it, it turns out, was random. None of it was improvised. The whole scene we thought we knew, the one we had watched 1,000 times on Fast Forward, was assembled out of pieces manufactured across thousands of years and clicked into place on a single afternoon, which leaves just one piece unaccounted for, and it is not on the hill. It is wherever you happen to be sitting right now. Because if the story is right about even half of this, then the thing lifted up on that wood is still lifted up, and the invitation attached to it has not changed and never grew more complicated than it was in the desert with the snakes, or on the cross with the dying criminal who simply turned his head. There is nothing here to earn, no towering effort required, no impossible standard to clear first. There is only, in the end, the same quiet instruction that has run through the whole thing from the beginning. Look. Turn your eyes toward the one lifted up and live. 25 details, assembled over thousands of years, all pointing at a single hill and a single choice. And that choice now belongs entirely to you. You can look, or you can walk on by. That part the story leaves, deliberately and entirely, in your hands.